Tolkien's Legendarium is a fictional masterpiece that spans hundreds of pages and thousands of years across volumes of works. It weaves an epic myth of creation and domination, a great struggle of good against evil, and the unassuming power of humility, companionship, and hope. Within are such memorable characters as Feanor, Luthien, Bilbo Baggins and Aragorn, dark lords as Morgoth and Sauron, and magical artifacts as the Silmarils and Rings of Power. What follows is a brief history of Middle-earth, the triumphs and tragedies told through 4 ages and a period before time. This video by no means discusses every character and plotline in detail, and is instead intended as a cursory guide through history for those new to or unfamiliar with Tolkien's work. Many significant events will be summarized and lesser events unmentioned. A note too that dates provided are estimates. The dating system records years within each age, with year 1 being the start of the age. The exception to this is the first age, which includes years before and years after the emergence of the sun. I also want to say I've tried my best with pronunciations for all the fictional words and names of different languages, but if I've misspoken, I only ask you to bear with me. From the creation of Arda to the birth of Eru's children, the rise of Sauron to the ultimate war of the Ring, let's dive in. Before space and time, before the physical universe, there existed the One. Eru Ilúvatar is the omniscient and omnipotent creator of all that is known and unknown, who took as his dwelling the timeless halls, said to stretch from abyss to firmament and exist beyond reality and void. Eru possessed an inspiring theme in his mind, a musical refrain the score of which told of all things to come, and desired beings to play this song, amplify it with their harmonies. And so from his thoughts, Eru created the Ainur. The Ainur are divine and immortal beings, kindled by Eru's imperishable flame, and formed from a distinct fraction of his mind. These celestials knew little beyond the part of Ilúvatar's mind from which they sprang. He gathered all and taught them through his song. Then Ilúvatar said to them, "Of the theme that I have declared to you, I will now that ye make it in harmony together a great music. And since I have kindled you with the flame imperishable, ye shall show forth your powers in adorning this theme, each with his own thoughts and devices, if he will. But I will sit and hearken, and be glad that through you great beauty has been wakened into song." With each Ainu adding their own unique creation to this foundational theme, it grew into a great harmony known as the Ainu Lindale, the music of the Ainur. After their themes played out, Eru showed the Ainur a vision, a globed world that coalesced from the void. On it, living things dwelt, and through it, great ages passed. This is what the Ainur had created with their song. They desired for this vision to become reality, and so Eru gave a great command. "Ea, let these things be, and I send forth into the void the flame imperishable, and it shall be the heart of the world, and the world shall be, and those of you that will may go down into it." Ea, the physical universe, would soon give rise to Arda, the world on which all things transpire. But reality was still protean, unformed. The Ainur would need to descend and use their power to shape it, guide it along the path of their shared vision, and make it habitable for the children of Ilúvatar. This was their greatest task and purpose of their labors: prepare the world for the coming of elves and men. Eru gave a warning: those who entered Ea would be forever tied to it, and there they would dwell until the end of days. 14 great and powerful Ainur, known as the Valar, the Holy Ones, the powers of Arda, entered Ea, and they were accompanied by lesser Ainur, called the Maiar. Maiar shared in temperament and design with the Valar to whom they were attached, acting as messengers, squires, and servants. Of the Valar, the Aratar, the 8, the High Ones of Arda, were greatest. Manwë was the king of the Valar and Arda, brother to Melkor and greatest Ainu in authority. The winds and great eagles of Arda were his allies. Varda, queen of the Valar, was Manwë's wife and the goddess of the stars. Ulmo was king of the sea and master of waters, who often stood apart in thought and act from the other Aratar. Then there were Yavanna and her husband Aule. She was goddess of the earth, the giver of life to flora and fauna, while he was the master of crafts, smithing and forging. Orome, the hunter, was among the most courageous and powerful of the Valar, who rode upon his steed and reveled in conquering great beasts. Then there was Nienna, the Vala of grief and mourning, but in whose pity great wisdom could be gleaned. Finally, Nienna's sibling was Mandos, the doomsman of the Valar, keeper of the houses of the dead, and lord of far-sighted prophecy. The Ainor's descent into Arda began the days before days, a period of roughly 3,500 Valian years before Iluvatar's children awoke and began recorded time. A 15th Ainur, named Melkor, also descended and would bring much ruin to Arda. Melkor was chief among Iluvatar's creations. To Melkor, among the Ainur, had been given the greatest gifts of power and knowledge, and he had a share in all the gifts of his brethren. Curiosity and ambition drove Melkor to darkness. He pursued glory and wished to create things of his own, as his father had done. Melkor's vanity was first felt in discord during the Ainulindale. He had begun to conceive thoughts of his own, unlike his brethren. Some of these thoughts he wove into his music, and straightway discord rose about him. His own theme challenged Eru's, but couldn't compete with his creator. Iluvatar admonished Melkor for this act, and reminded him that in all Melkor did and would do, the divine will of Eru dwelt, which only planted within the Ainu seeds of hatred and resentment. When the Valar descended to Arda, Melkor saw an opportunity to fulfill his desire for domination. He joined them and claimed the unshaped primordial world as his kingdom of Arda. But Manwë, brother to Melkor and equal in will, the true king of Arda, rallied the other Valar against Melkor and pushed him to the edge of the void. As the Valar then busied themselves with Arda's shaping, Melkor watched from afar. Malice cloaked his form in darkness. Hate made him master of fire and cold. He soon struck at the Valar, beginning the First War, which saw great clashes of power over many years and brought with it the marring of Arda. For the Valar built lands and Melkor destroyed them. Valleys they delved and Melkor raised them up. Mountains they carved and Melkor threw them down. Seas they hollowed and Melkor spilled them. Though much was marred with Melkor's corruption, Arda continued to take shape as lands, continents, seas, and skies formed. The First War ended with the arrival of the Vala Tulkas the Strong, a bellicose and unconquerable force, whose laughter gave Melkor pause and forced the evil god to flee beyond the end of the world to escape his wrath. With Melkor checked, the Valar created the two lamps that stood in north and south and cast all Arda in a soft, eternal glow. Placed on the tower Helkar, Iluin, the northern lamp, shone with a soft blue light, while Ormal, the southern lamp, was set on the tower Ringil and cast all in golden hues. They finalized the molding of Arda and erected the island of Almarin as their abode to rest from their labors. Then, the seeds of Yavanna, queen of the earth, took root. A period of unbridled growth, peace, and light blanketed the world called the Spring of Arda. Though Melkor was banished, he wasn't defeated, and quickly returned in secret to the north of Arda. Here, he raised mountains and dug the impressive redoubt of Utumno, greatest of all his citadels, where forces of evil and those divine spirits corrupted by his presence gathered. Horrors, demons, fallen Maiar came to their twisted lord and spread plague across the land. With sufficient force gathered, Melkor struck swiftly at his brethren. But Melkor, trusting in the strength of Utumno and the might of his servants, came forth suddenly to war and struck the first blow, ere the Valar were prepared, and he assailed the light of Iluin and Ormal and cast down their pillars and broke their lamps. Melkor destroyed the two lamps alongside the Valar's residence on the Isle of Almarin, and then shattered the Spring of Arda. The Valar placed surviving creatures in protective hibernation to spare their lives. The Valar then retreated from Middle-earth and other eastern lands to the western continent of Aman. Here they raised a mountain barrier to hamper Melkor's pursuit and carved out the realm of Valinor. This great kingdom of beauty and light stood as bulwark against Melkor's darkness. The song of Yavanna and the tears of Nienna wove a tale of grief for the two lanterns and fallen spring of Arda. From this dirge, two shoots emerged from the earth and grew into magically charged, luminescent trees. The silver Telperion and the golden Lorelin. These trees bathed all Valinor in light. Their waxing and waning, like a dance, gave rise to day, night, and the passage of time. Thus began the years of the trees. Also known as the Blessed Realm and the Undying Lands, Aman stretched thin from Arda's north to south and contained several regions within. Both Araman and Avathar, the northern and southern reaches respectively, stood beyond the Valar's protective mountain range and were largely wild and abandoned. In the center, the Valar's abode of Valinor contained the plains of Yavanna, where golden waves of crop dazzled in the breeze, and also the glade and gardens of Lorien, most beautiful of all places of nature. Valimar, the city of many bells, was home to several Valar and most of their Maiar companions. At the summit of the Pelori mountain range, Manwë and Varda created their mansion of Taniquetil, the vantages of which it was said allowed them to perceive all of Arda. While Aman prospered in light, Middle-earth and the eastern lands remained in darkness. Under its cover, Melkor gathered strength, spread his influence, and assessed his domain. He erected mountain ranges and bastions of evil to repel future attacks from the Valar. Near the northwest shores of the Great Sea, Melkor constructed the fortress armory of Angband and charged his peerless Maiar lieutenant Sauron with its keep. Originally an apprentice of Aule, the smith and Vala of crafts and ingenuity, Sauron was seduced by Melkor's promise of willful domination of all things and joined his dark ranks. With the Valar in distant Aman, Melkor transformed Middle-earth into his domain, though he was frequently resisted by those Valar who refused to forsake the continent. Among them Ulmo, master of seas, Yavanna the nurturer, and Orome the hunter, who often tracked both Melkor and his demonic hosts, slaying untold horrors. Roughly 1,000 years into the years of the trees, the Valar held a council where they discussed the threat of an ascendant Melkor and their anxieties about the coming of Iluvatar's children. Melkor's spite left much of Arda dark and dangerous, and the Valar feared Eru's children wouldn't stand long against him. They endeavored to find the children as they awakened and escort them to safety, or else hunt Melkor down to his hidden domain and bring hope to Middle-earth. At this time, Varda, wife to Manwë and queen of the Valar, lit the heavens with myriad stars and constellations to watch over the coming children. Their soft glow illuminated dark Middle-earth and undermined Melkor's confidence. In secret, Aule created the first dwarves, for so greatly did Aule desire the coming of the children, to have learners to whom he could teach, that he was unwilling to await the fulfillment of the designs of Iluvatar. In Aule's act, Eru saw the willful impatience of Melkor, but so true and humble was the Vala that rather than smite the dwarves, Iluvatar adopted them as his own. None, however, were to precede the first children, so the dwarves were put to rest deep in Middle-earth until their time arrived. Finally, 1,050 years into the years of the trees, the Valar's waiting ended, and the first children of Iluvatar, the elves, awakened beside the starlit mere Cuivianen, the Water of Awakening. Thus began the First Age, the longest age of Middle-earth that spanned two different dating systems, the years of the trees and the years of the sun, all told a nearly 5,000 solar year-long period. The elves, who named themselves the Quendi, or those who speak with voices, toiled by the lake and under the stars for many years, while the Valar zealously searched them out. Melkor, however, was first to discover the Quendi through spirits, spies, and fell beasts. He preyed on the firstborn, struck fear into their hearts, and kidnapped many of Iluvatar's children. Deep in the caverns of Utumno, fueled by malice, he performed the most infernal of all his grievances. And by slow arts of cruelty, the Quendi were corrupted and enslaved, and thus did Melkor breed the hideous race of orcs, in envy and mockery of the elves, of whom they were afterwards the bitterest foes. Twisted from beauty, defiled by their creation, the orcs hated and feared Melkor, but would ever remain his servants. In 1085 Year Tree, Orome the Hunter finally discovered the elves and reported to the Valar and Aman of both the awakening and Melkor's predations. 5 years later, the combined might of the Valar made war on Melkor to save the Quendi in the Battle of the Powers. This epic struggle sundered the earth, roiled the seas, and created new lands. The Valar's strength liberated Middle-earth. They besieged the citadel of Utumno, laid waste to Melkor's forces, and bound the god in chains. Though the Valar emerged victorious, they failed to disassemble all Melkor's power, and many evils, including Sauron, evaded capture. Another 10 years later, in 1100-year Tree, Melkor was dragged before all Valar in the Ring of Doom on Valinor, and his sentence passed. For his treasonous crimes, Melkor was imprisoned within the halls of Mandos for 3 ages, or roughly 3,000 solar years. Also called the Halls of Awaiting and watched over by the Vala of Portents and Dooms Mandos, this was where spirits would linger and await judgment or rebirth. Sealed by fate, none could escape the cavernous halls. With the great enemy defeated and evil diminished, the Valar held council and decided to invite the elves to dwell in the light-blessed kingdom of Aman for leisure and protection. 3 of the elves' ambassadors, Ingwe, Finwë, and Elwë, were brought to Valinor in an effort to amaze and convince them to lead their people to the Valar. The ambassadors were so transfixed by Valinor's beauty and spellbound by the Valar's majesty that upon their return to Cuiviénen, they extolled Amon's virtue. But the firstborn agreed on nothing. Some refused to leave. Others argued over the time and route of their path. This disagreement and the arduous migration across Middle-earth to the west in a roughly 30-year period from 1105 to 1133-year Tree brought about the first and second sundering of the elves. From it were born the different races of elves who settled the myriad realms of Arda. The first distinction must be made between those who began the journey and those who refused to leave the waters of awakening. The Avari, or the unwilling, remained near the Cuiviénen, while the Eldar were all who began the great journey towards Aman. The Eldar were divided into 3 large migratory hosts, each led by an ambassador king. Ingwe's people were known as the Vanyar, the Fair Elves, and were the smallest group. Next came Finwë and the Noldor, the Deep Elves. The last group was so large it was divided into 2 by Elwë Greymantle and his brother Olwë. Many of these elves tarried on the road or else gave up the journey entirely and became known as the Teleri. The firstborn were led by Vala Orome through the dark and mysterious lands of Middle-earth for many years. The Vanyar, Noldor, and those Teleri that made it to Aman are collectively called the Amanyar, or Calaquendi, the Elves of Light, for they had seen the glow of the 2 trees. The Teleri who remained on Middle-earth, of which were the Sindar, Nandor, and Lyquendi, are with the Avari collectively known as the Morequendi, the Elves of Darkness, for they never saw the light of the trees. The Morequendi settled regions that would come to be known as Beleriand, Eriador, and others. By the Bay of Balar and estuary of the river Gelion, the Eldar waited while Orome discussed with other Valar the logistics of transporting the elves across the sea. While they waited, King Elwë walked through a wood and happened upon the Maya Melian, whose beauty and song were so enchanting that all the creatures and gods of Arda would pause, forget themselves, and drown in her splendor. Elwë sat entranced. His deep love for Melian grew, as did hers for him, and for years the Teleri remained in Beleriand to look for their lost king. Elwë's brother Olwë assumed leadership of the Teleri, who continued on their journey. Once Elwë and Melian were broken from their trance, they returned to the Teleri who remained loyal, the Sindar, or Grey Elves. They made Beleriand their home, and Doriath their kingdom. Elwë took Melian as his betrothed, remembered after as Elu Thingol, King Greymantle. The other Teleri that followed Elwë's brother Olwë migrated to the mouth of Sirion and along the coast where there grew a love for the sea. They became the Elves of the Falas, whose cities were Brithombar and Eglarest. Finally, after years of sojourn and sundering of elvish bloodlines, the Vanyar and Noldor crossed the sea into Aman, atop a massive island moved by the Valar in 1133 Year Tree. Here they settled the land of Elendë, or Elvenhome, and built spectacular cities such as Tirion and Alqualonde. The beauty of these white, glistening towns was to give thanks to the Valar and bless the ever-fruitful realm of Aman, a cherished prize worthy of their long travels. Some Teleri arrived on another landmass close to Aman, but never quite reached it. In the Bay of Eldamar, their island of Tol Eressëa remained in the sea, and they built the port of Avalone. For long the elves prospered in the Blessed Realm, served and conversed with the Valar, tended their white tree of Tirion, bestowed by Yavanna, and birthed several new generations. In 1169 Year Tree, King Finwë and his wife Miriel gave birth to their first son, Feanor, one of the most significant and tragic figures of the First Age. From Feanor's actions came both untarnished beauty and irreparable damage. The lamentations and exultations of Feanor are recorded in the Silmarillion and other works of lore. Raised by his father after his mother's death, Feanor was tall and fair of face, and masterful, in the pursuit of all his purposes eager and steadfast. He became of all the Noldor, then or after, the most subtle in mind and the most skilled in hand. This period of harmonious glory was known as the Noontide of Valinor, where Valar and Elf grew together. Abroad, in Middle-earth too, much was gained. In 1250 Year Tree, the dwarves who had remained unknown to the elves since their awakening first appeared in Beleriand. Concerning the beginning of the dwarves, strange tales are told both by the Eldar and by the dwarves themselves. Durin is the name that the dwarves used for the eldest of the 7 fathers of their race, and the ancestor of all the kings of the Longbeards. In the east of the Misty Mountains, he made his dwelling, where afterwards were the mines of Moria, renowned in song. But the dwarves of Beleriand hailed from other houses, the Firebeards and Broadbeams, who dwelt beneath the Blue Mountains. The two races coexisted. Dwarves taught the elves of smithing, armaments, cavern dwellings, while the elves traded in jewels of the sea and taught of natural order. Together, under the auspices of Thingol, king of the Sindar, they chiseled the great dwelling of Menegroth, the Thousand Caves, to act as capital of Doriath, brightest kingdom in Beleriand. But this idol wouldn't last forever, and though Melkor was chained in the halls of Mandos, the ages of his finite sentence continued to pass. Elsewhere in Middle-earth, the remnants of his dark forces stirred. In 1330 Year Tree, orcs made their first inroads through Beleriand, and though they were destroyed by the combined dwarves and elves, this marked an inexorable encroachment of evil. Some 20 years later, a contingent of Nandor, led by Denethor, fled the darkness of the east into Beleriand, and through Thingol's largesse were granted the lands of Osiriand. Strife too entered the realm of Eldamar, and the house of Finwë, king of the Noldor. Feanor was the king's first son, his most cherished, and the sole child of his now deceased wife. But Feanor wasn't the only offspring of Finwë. He remarried the elf Indis and raised 4 more children, including Prince Fingolfin. It's told that Fingolfin was the strongest, the most steadfast, and the most valiant of Finwë's sons, and ever there was a coldness between Feanor and his half-siblings. Rivalry turned to estrangement and then outright contempt, whose flames were purposely fanned by dark forces. The princes of Finwë were bright and good, but quick-tempered, their emotions easily manipulated, which would soon bring doom upon them. In 1400 Year Tree, the 3 ages of Melkor's imprisonment ended, and he was brought before the Valar. The god pled his soul's reparation, admitted guilt and fault for his actions, and begged reconciliation with his brethren. The Valar were wary of Melkor, but they harbored no evil in their hearts, and so couldn't conceive deception. They took Melkor at his word, and therefore, in a while he was given leave to go freely about the land, and it seemed to Manwë that the evil of Melkor was cured. But words were all he gave. Deep in his heart, Melkor despised the Valar and hated the children of Ilúvatar. He feigned friendship while secretly concocting plots to ruin Aman. In the House of Finwë and the rivalry between his sons, Melkor found the weakest link, ears gullible to lies and hearts easily incensed. For years Melkor walked amongst Noldor as a friend, imparting gifts and wisdom, but also spreading falsehoods and staining wills with his evil. In the following years, Feanor pursued his most ambitious project. After mastering the craft of smithing and metallurgy, which culminated in invention of the substance Selima, Feanor constructed the Silmarils. These three jewels of immense beauty stored within them the light of Valinor's trees. Therefore, even in the darkness of the deepest treasury, the Silmarils of their own radiance shone like the stars of Varda. And yet, as were they indeed living things, they rejoiced in light and received it, and gave it back in hues more marvelous than before. Feanor put his very soul into their creation, and it's said that no other work in Arda, before or since, surpassed them in greatness. They were finished in 1450 Year Tree, and blessed by the Valar, so that no evil could hold the Silmarils. Envy raged within Melkor upon witnessing the Silmarils, and he sought to quickly bring them into possession by opening the rift he had been forming between elves and Valar. Melkor poisoned the minds of elves with falsehoods, stating that the Valar brought the Eldar to Aman from jealousy. He said the Valar resented the children of Ilúvatar for their gift of ruling Arda, and so imprisoned them in Aman. To sow further discord, he revealed the coming of men, second of Ilúvatar's children, knowledge of whom the Valar had kept from the Eldar. Concern and disillusionment spread, especially amongst the Noldor, on whom Melkor focused his wrath. Where once humility and deference dwelt, pride, jealousy, and anger ruled the hearts of elves. Most affected was Prince Feanor, whose zealous spirit filled him with ambition and a desire for freedom. Soon smithies forged weapons and shields, disgruntled elves took up arms, and Feanor now began openly to speak words of rebellion against the Valar, crying aloud that he would depart from Valinor back to the world without, and would deliver the Noldor from thraldom if they would follow him. Discontent reached a crescendo in 1490 Year Tree, when King Finwë summoned a council to repair the strife amongst Noldor. Here, an impassioned Feanor drew his sword against his half-brother Fingolfin, an act of ill will forbidden in Aman. The Valar banished Feanor from Tirion to Formenos, where he would remain in exile for 12 years alongside his sons and his father Finwë. Shortly into his exile, Melkor approached Feanor and believed he could wrest possession of the Silmarils from their creator. Melkor attempted deceit, but his cunning overreached his aim. His words touched too deep and awoke a fire more fierce than he designed, and Feanor looked upon Melkor with eyes that burned through his fair semblance and pierced the cloaks of his mind, perceiving there his fierce lust for the Silmarils. Feanor expelled Melkor, who took flight from Aman, and Finwë ran to the Valar in warning. Melkor's plan derailed, but Avala isn't so easily beaten. He retreated to the dark lands of Avathar in southern Aman, and there he happened upon Ungoliant. The origins of Ungoliant were shrouded in mystery, but some believed she hailed from the darkness beyond Arda in the years before time. Her hunger was insatiable, and though she hated light, she was drawn to it, desiring to devour it and all life. Ungoliant took the form of a massive spider who wove dark nets of strangling doom, and wielded the power of unlight. Not merely the absence of light, but a profound darkness, a force of the abyss unto itself, that not even the eyes of the Valar could dispel. Melkor struck a bargain with the demon. If she shrouded their movement with unlight, he would assist Ungoliant in devouring all the light of Valinor, draining the two trees and gobbling up the Eldar's precious gems. Woe befell Arda in 1495 Year Tree, when Melkor and Ungoliant crept past the walls of Valinor. Together, they struck at the brilliant heart of Aman. Melkor's dark spear cut through the bark of the two trees as Ungoliant's fangs sunk deep, draining the trees of light and life, and poisoning them with incurable toxins. The great cloak of unlight threw Valinor into dismay. Both Valar and Eldar were hopeless to stop the assault. Not content with the death of the trees, Melkor then rushed to Formenos to strike at his most hated enemy Feanor, and steal that which was closest to him. In the great halls of Formenos, Melkor killed Finwë, king of the Noldor, snatched the Silmarils, and fled Aman to his old power base in Middle-earth. Aman was dealt a crushing blow. Despite Yavanna and Nienna's best restorative efforts, the two trees of Valinor were beyond saving, and the greatest light Arda had ever known snuffed. Thus, Ungoliant and Melkor's assault was recorded as the darkening of Valinor. All that remained of their essence resided in the stolen Silmarils. Eldar and Valar alike wept, none more so than Feanor, who had not only lost the light, but his father whom he loved, and his greatest works of art. He cursed Melkor as Morgoth, the dark enemy and black foe, for which he was ever after named. Unquenchable rage, guilt, and conviction seethed within Feanor, who shortly swore his infamous oath alongside his sons. This dreadful and unbreakable vow was the culmination of Feanor's oration to the Noldor. Here, he swore to go against any and all forces, evil or good, Valar, Eldar, or mortal, that stood against him in pursuit of the Silmarils and vengeance for the House of Finwë. Following the oath of Feanor, Mandos, Vala of portents and fates, gave to the Noldor their doom. Their oath shall drive them, and yet betray them, and ever snatch away the very treasures that they have sworn to pursue. Both the oath of Feanor and the doom or curse of Mandos followed the Noldor throughout the First Age and marred all they touched. Those wrapped by events into the doom were met with woe. These happenings marked the flight and the downfall of the Noldor from Aman. The flight of the Noldor rapidly unfolded in the waning days of the 15th century year tree. The oath of Feanor was an open rebellion against Amon's ruling gods, and even if they hadn't left the continent of their own accord, the Valar would have forced them into exile for treason. Feanor and his sons led the vanguard of Noldor, but his half-brother Fingolfin championed the greatest host of elves, most of which refused to acknowledge Feanor as their king. Some of the Noldor even threw down their arms and pleaded with the Valar to remain in Aman. As the Noldor set out, a messenger of Manwë arrived. The Valar wouldn't hinder Feanor in his vengeance, but neither would they assist him. They demanded he unlearn the bitterness and malice of Morgoth in his own time. In haste and with false belief that he was liberating his people, Feanor led the Noldor for the last time out of the gates of Tirion and pursued Morgoth north. Meanwhile, Morgoth and Ungoliant settled in the region of Beleriand to recoup. Here, Ungoliant demanded that the Vala fulfill his promise, and she sensed he still held great jewels of light on his person. Morgoth fed Ungoliant many stones, but refused to part with the brilliant Silmarils, which had already burned his evil hands. He and his servants repelled the spider, who slinked to the dark corners of the world. Morgoth then returned to his old citadel of Angband, which had survived the Valar's wrath under Sauron's stewardship. He reinforced it by raising the volcanic mountains of Thangorodrim far to the north of Beleriand, then crafted an iron crown bejeweled by the Silmarils, and declared himself King of Middle-earth. Feanor met his first obstacle in the Great Sea, for the Noldor weren't skilled in shipmaking, nor could they safely traverse the dangerous ice floes in the north. He led a contingent of his people to Alqualonde, the Swan Haven and city of the Teleran master shipwrights, who crafted renowned vessels. The Noldor demanded use of Alqualonde's white ships, and when the Teleri refused, Feanor's people drew swords. A great and tragic massacre, known as the Kinslaying, followed, in which Noldoran warriors cut down Teleran mariners armed with little more than hunting bows. This was a dark stain on the Noldor, and evidence of the power of both the Oath and Doom that would bring their ruin. With ships acquired, the Noldor marched north to cross the sea at the Hel Caraxe. On Middle-earth, Morgoth instigated the wars of Beleriand against the dwarves and Sindarin elves of Teleran descent. Now the orcs that multiplied in the darkness of the earth grew strong and fell, and their dark lord filled them with a lust of ruin and death, and they issued from Angband's gates under the clouds that Morgoth sent forth. Círdan and the elves of western Beleriand were bested and pushed to the rim of the sea in Falas, while Thingol and his allies slew countless orc armies. His wife, Queen Melian, cast a magical girdle around the kingdom of Doriath, which protected it from interlopers. Back in northern Aman, the Noldor prepared to embark across the sea, and the ever-willful Feanor committed deep treachery. There were too few ships to carry all the elves. The frigid ice bridge of Hel Caraxe was deemed impassable, and every moment the Eldar suffered in the cold, they cursed Feanor. In secret, and with only the Noldor he trusted as true to his cause, Feanor sailed across the sea to Middle-earth and left behind Fingolfin as well as many elves. When they made landfall at Lamoth in the Firth of Drengist, Maedhros, Feanor's eldest son and friend to many in Fingolfin's house, asked to send ships back and ferry the remaining elves. But Feanor spoke, "What I have left behind I count now no loss. Needless baggage on the road it has proved. Let the ships burn." And his men set fire to the most pure vessels ever crafted. The flames lit the night sky, and across the strait, Fingolfin knew he had been betrayed. A significant rift opened between the separate groups of Noldor, and with steely resolve, Fingolfin's host crossed the ice floes on foot, but lost many. They were spurred by a need for answers or vengeance. But the ship's burning flames weren't only witnessed by elves. Morgoth's orcs were alerted to Feanor's presence in Middle-earth, and a large army was sent against them as they marched from the sea to the grey fields of Mithrim in a region known as Hithlum. Here, the second great battle in the Wars of Beleriand unfolded. Dagor Nuin Gileath it was called, Battle Under the Stars, and though the Noldor were outnumbered, they still shone with the light of Valinor and emerged victorious. The orcs routed and fled towards Angband. The impetuous Feanor pursued them up to the citadel's outer defenses before support could follow him, and only then did the red mist of fervor clear and the elf realize he was outmatched. He therefore stood alone against an onslaught of Balrog demons and fell beasts, suffering their wrath until his sons bore him away from battle. Feanor, first among the Noldor, crafter of the Silmarils, orchestrator of the exile, was mortally wounded and soon died in 1497 Year Tree. Morgoth had slain his fiercest foe. To add insult to his victory, Morgoth deceived Feanor's son Maedhros into a spurious truce meeting, then captured the elf and chained him as a prize atop his volcanic mountains. Though Feanor accused the Valar of weakness and inaction in the aftermath of the darkening of Valinor, they were guilty of neither. On Aman, in grave council around the Ring of Doom, and in the presence of the dying trees, the Valar worked collectively to bring forth a boon to all of Arda. They drew on the last strength and light of the two trees to harvest the final flower of silver and final fruit of gold. Their radiance was preserved and placed in hallowed vessels that were then cast up into the firmament and became the moon and the sun. Thus, in 1500 Year Tree, the years of the trees ended and the years of the sun began, also marked here as FA or the First Age proper. The two orbs illuminated Middle-earth, which had remained dark since the toppling of the Valar's lamps, and awakened many races on the continent that had been in hibernation of Yavanna's sleep. This led to a period of rapid growth, known as the Second Spring of Arda, where life teemed upon the soil and in the waters, and the Eldar increased, and beneath the sun, Beleriand grew green and fair. This was made all the more serene because the sun cast such harsh light on Morgoth that his innumerable hordes of evil retreated to dark caverns. Sunlight damaged orcs and other fell creatures, and its passing greatly diminished Morgoth. But after bestowing this gift to Arda, the Valar retreated from the rest of the world. They raised sheer cliffs along Amon's coast and set the enchanted isles, which through shadows and bewilderment kept all from the continent's light. Thus did the hiding of Valinor shut the blessed realm against the Noldor in exile. The birth of Sun and Moon coincided with a long-awaited event, the awakening of Ilúvatar's second-born children, the Hildur, the Aftercomers, the Men of Middle-earth. Men rose in unknown lands far to the east of Middle-earth, called Hildorian, and were distinct from the elves in that Eru Ilúvatar imparted his gift upon them, death. Men not only were physically mortal, but after passing, their spirit released beyond the confines of Arda, whereas the elven spirits were forever tied to the world. We are told that men were more frail, more easily slain by weapon or mischance, and less easily healed, subject to sickness and many ills, and they grew old and died. The gift of men also gave them more freedom to alter or shape their fates, an unpredictable but courageous people. Though none can say with certainty, the elves believe there is evidence to suggest Morgoth visited the Hildor in their nascency and stained their hearts with indelible darkness. Some grew to worship him, and he imparted in most fear rather than appreciation for Iluvatar's gift, which would be the seed for many atrocities in mankind's future. If Morgoth did visit men in their first days, he alone among the Valar did so. The others, it seemed, forsook the race of men and remained beyond the sea. To Hildorian there came no Vala to guide men, or to summon them to dwell in Valinor, and men have feared the Valar rather than loved them, and have not understood the purpose of the powers, being at variance with them and at strife with the world. The Hildor, though, grew enamored with the sun and traced its path west, leaving their ancestral lands in a journey that would take them centuries, but bring them to Beleriand. The first rising of the sun also saw the host of Fingolfin land on Middle-earth after their treacherous ice crossing, and with the aid of its brilliant light, drove legions of orcs to the very gates of Angband. But Fingolfin's temperament was more cool and cautious than his half-brother Feanor, and he knew the elves lacked strength to breach Morgoth's abode, so they withdrew to Lake Mithrim, where the Noldor of Feanor camped, leaderless. Resentment between the houses of elves burned hotter than the smoldering ashes of the white ships. Fingon, son of Fingolfin, and dear friend of the missing Maedhros, sought out the captive heir of Feanor to assuage ill will. With the assistance of eagles sent by the Valar, Fingon reached the peaks of Thangorodrim and liberated Maedhros. In the 7th year of the sun, the Noldor held council in Mithrim with an air of reconciliation. Maedhros renounced his claim to lordship and agreed to go with the house of Feanor to settle the northern marches of East Beleriand. Fingolfin was elevated to king of the Noldor, and the schism between the two houses repaired. The coming of the Noldor troubled the Teleri of Beleriand, especially King Thingol of Doriath, who saw the Eldar princes not quite as friends, but rather ambitious lords with minds bent on carving their own kingdoms. The Sindarin were apprehensive, and Thingol granted Noldor leave to claim unsettled lands in the north, east, and parts of the south, but retained his lordship over the realm of western Beleriand, and especially suffered few to enter the enchanted lands of Doriath. In First Age 20, King Fingolfin held a feast to celebrate the return of the Noldor to Middle-earth, and to reunite Noldor clans with their Teleri kin. Embassies from the Noldoran princes arrived, the Green Elves of Osiriand, the Grey Elves, Círdan the Shipwright, and Lord of Falas, but only 2 from King Thingol's court. It was a success and bound closely elven houses that had long been estranged. Their solidarity strengthened each clan against Morgoth. The elves busied themselves with kingdom building and administration, and Morgoth's spies believed them to have turned a blind eye to Angband. He launched an assault of orcs many legions strong across the plain of Ard Galen, against both Noldor and Sindar. The elves fought against them in First Age 60 in the 3rd battle of the Wars for Beleriand, known as Dagor Aglareb, or the Glorious Battle, so named because of the overwhelming victory achieved by the elves. They slaughtered and pursued the routed orcs to the gates of Angband, where the remainder were set upon. The Noldor used the momentum of this victory to invest themselves around Morgoth's fortress and began the siege of Angband, a struggle of attrition that lasted nearly 400 years. The elves could never completely surround the citadel and starve its garrison of resources, but neither could Morgoth muster sufficient force to break the valiant elves' blockade. He tried 100 years into the siege, but after his orcs were massacred, he realized they would never be the Noldor's equal in combat. 200 years into their investment, Glaurung, first of the dragons, sallied forth and wrought fiery desolation. He was, however, immature and hadn't come into full power, so was pushed back to Angband. These brief skirmishes were the only breaks in the siege, and the next 200 years after, were known as the Long Peace, where Morgoth's ambitions for Beleriand were checked. Much unfolded in the years of the siege. Maedhros and the 6 other sons of Feanor took their houses east and settled as marcher lords of Beleriand's buffer zones. Their northern lands remained ever vigilant against Morgoth, and the eastern plains looked towards the vast wilderness of Middle-earth. Fingolfin, High King of the Noldor, remained in Hithlum with his children Fingon and Turgon. Turgon ruled initially from Vinyamar on the western coast of Nevrast, but after receiving visions from the Vala Ulmo, he discovered the hidden vale of Tumladen, where he built the secret and majestic city of Gondolin. He moved his people from Nevrast in silence, and they remained in the hidden city for many centuries. Its location kept from friend and foe alike, and its pass guarded by the King of the Eagles. Finrod and Galadriel, children of Finarfin, who had remained in Aman during the flight of the Noldor, stayed as guests in the kingdom of Doriath, as they shared familial bonds with Thingol. In conversation with Queen Melian, Galadriel revealed the existence of the Silmarils, and the queen suspected treacherous acts Noldorian elves perpetrated in the kinslaying of Alqualonde. Morgoth used this opportunity to sow lies that spread through the Sindarin lands of Falas and Doriath, and incensed these kingdoms against the Noldor. Betrayed by the withholding of information and angered by what seemed Noldorian malice, Thingol banished the Noldor from his realm and outlawed their language forever. Finrod, inspired by the grandeur of Menegroth and also given visions of secret places by the Vala Ulmo, traveled south. Thus Finrod came to the caverns of Narog and began to establish there deep halls and armories after the fashion of the mansions of Menegroth, and that stronghold was called Nargothrond. This realm rested between the Falas and the kingdom of Doriath in West Beleriand. With Nargothrond's completion, Finrod left the island fortress of Minas Tirith that guarded the pass of Sirion to the stewardship of his nephew and moved his household to the cavernous city along River Narog. Though Finrod was a western ruler, he enjoyed travels far afield and sought Middle-earth's precious glory. He came to the house of Feanor in eastern Beleriand to visit and hunt, where in First Age 310, Finrod happened upon something that would forever alter his and his people's lives: the coming of men to Beleriand. Beor, their chieftain, led a group of humans from Hildorian ever westward and crossed the Blue Mountains into Osiriand. In Beor's words, "A darkness lies behind us, and we have turned our backs upon it, and we do not desire to return thither, even in thought. Westward our hearts have been turned, and we believe that there we shall find light." Men chased both the westerning sun, and rumors passed to them in their travels by dark elves of Valinor and its ruling gods, the Valar. Early in relations, the elves perceived Morgoth's wickedness within the Second-born. His spies and lies corrupted many as a darkness that lay upon the hearts of men. Of the men that worshipped Morgoth, most remained in the dark realms as the Easterlings. But besides Beor's tribe, 2 others came west and retained lightness and valor in their hearts. The 3 noble houses were that of Beor, who became vassal and friend to Finrod Felagund and the house of Finarfin. They settled the lands of Estelad and Dorthonion in northern Beleriand. The house of Haleth, also known as the Haladin, were woodsmen and survivalists with little cohesion. After their first leader Haldad united them against forces of evil, his daughter Haleth brought her people to the forest of Brethil in Doriath, where they remained mostly to themselves. Finally, the largest host came from the house of Hador, who were numerous and warlike, and made the elves of Osiriand anxious. They settled in Hithlum, the realm of Fingolfin and his son Fingon, the region of Dor-Lomin, and swore loyalty to their house. Combined, these 3 houses of men were called the Edain, gallant elf friends, fairest of the second children, who fought bravely in the wars of Beleriand, and whose descendants would forge great kingdoms in the Second and Third Ages. For nearly 150 years men traveled, settled throughout Beleriand, and learned much in lore and craft from the Noldor during the Long Peace. Though the second children were lesser in life and knowledge, they made up for it in courage. Relations between the 2 races blossomed, but as long as Morgoth remained in Middle-earth, evil seeds would be planted in fields of joy. The Dark Lord sent many servants to observe and sow discontent, for he feared the union of elves and men. The Silmarillion tells of such lies. Those who seek the dominion of Middle-earth are the Eldar. Greedy for wealth, they have delved in the earth for its secrets, and have stirred to wrath the things that dwell beneath it. Let the orcs have the realm that is theirs, and we will have ours. There is room in the world if the Eldar let us be. So even while the Northern Leaguer held Morgoth's forces in Angband, evil still worked in Beleriand, and only utmost vigilance held the long peace. In First Age 455, Fingolfin, High King of the Noldor, considered an assault on Morgoth with the full might of elf and man. Thus arrayed, he hoped to enter Angband and rid Middle-earth of his people's enemy forever. But many grew complacent in the long peace, and desired not for war but to remain in their idle. Only the Marcher lords who constantly battled were eager to pursue a definitive struggle. The rest had long forgotten the threat of evil, and that became their doom. The Silmarillion recounts. Then suddenly Morgoth sent forth great rivers of flame and poured over all the plain, and the mountains of iron belched forth fires of poisonous hues, and the fume of them stank upon the air, and was deadly. Thus Ardgallen perished, and fire devoured its grasses, and it became a burned and desolate waste, full of a choking dust, barren and lifeless. Thus began the fourth of the great battles, Dagor Bragolach, the Battle of Sudden Flame. Balrogs, dragons, seething legions of orcs, and all manner of fell beasts issued forth from Angband with such swift and unsuspected force that they, combined with Morgoth's conflagration, broke the siege of Angband. Many of the bravest elves and men were destroyed in the first days of that battle, as were the greatest earthenworks and fortresses that had contained Morgoth. Though the battle did come to an end, war never ceased again in Beleriand. The Noldor, Sindar, and men were routed and scattered from one another, unable to coordinate proper defense. The elves and men of Finarfin's house were greatly diminished and pushed back beyond the pass of Sirion. The realm of Hithlum remained, but Fingolfin's house was severed from the rest of Beleriand by orc armies. The east marches under the sons of Feanor suffered terrible loss and were assailed by the great dragon Glaurung. Nearly all lands were taken, save the fortress upon Himring, due to the valor of Medros. The Battle of Sudden Flame's immediate aftermath saw the death of many princes and lords of man and elf, Dorthonion and the lands of Finarfin's sons lost, and the sons of Feanor driven back. The Noldor had never suffered such a complete defeat. Hope shattered as Morgoth came ascendant. Despair drove Fingolfin to madness and his last act as High King. Then Fingolfin beheld the utter ruin of the Noldor, and the defeat beyond redress of all their houses. A great madness of rage was upon him, so that his eyes shone like the eyes of the Valar. Thus he came alone to Angband's gates, and he sounded his horn, and challenged Morgoth to come forth to single combat. And Morgoth came. Their duel echoed with a grand clash, and though Fingolfin was most proud and valiant of the elven kings, though he wounded Morgoth, he was no match for Avala, and crushed. With the High King slain, the title of Lord of the Noldor went to Fingolfin's son, Fingon. Following the Fourth Great Battle, resistance against Morgoth remained in the men of Dorthonion, who refused to flee, but were mercilessly hunted over the years. Minas Tirith stood as a defensive bastion along the pass of Sirion for 2 years before Morgoth dispatched his lieutenant Sauron to subdue it. It was defiled and became Tol in Garoth, the Isle of Werewolves, where Sauron watched his enemies. Of those captured in the Battle of Sudden Flame, many were broken or twisted to evil and sent to spread discord between elves and men. Here the doom of Mandos and the curse of the kinslaying worked against the Noldor, as Morgoth's lies were taken as truth, animosity and blame hurled. In 463 First Age, while recuperating from his loss, a group of Easterlings known as the Swarthy Men entered Maedhros' land. The Elven Lord direly needed allies, so entered in league with the Easterlings to confront orc armies. But unbeknownst to Maedhros, many of the swarthy men had sworn secret loyalty to the Dark Lord, and Morgoth's agents were planted close at hand. At the same time, Morgoth renewed his assault on the west against Hithlum. Fingon's forces were hard-pressed, and many of the Edain nobility perished, but finally the attack was broken with the arrival of Círdan and the elves of the Falas upon the Firth of Drengist. So in the wake of Dagor Bragolach, Morgoth destroyed the northern lands of his enemies, dispersed the eastern marches, pressed the Noldor far into the west, and captured the pass of Sirion. Still, he feared the hidden strength of Doriath, whose elves had taken minimal action in the wars of Beleriand thus far, as well as the secret realms of Turgon in Gondolin and Finrod in Nargothrond. On the back of such victory, Morgoth suffered a humiliating defeat of sorts when in 465 First Age, Beren, a man from the house of Beor, undertook the quest for the Silmaril. Beren loved Luthien Tinuviel, daughter of Ilu Thingol and the Maya Melian, and for her hand King Thingol demanded Beren bring him the Silmarils. But this decree tied Thingol and all of Doriath to the curse of the Noldor and the Silmarillion reeds. Thus he wrought the doom of Doriath, and was ensnared within the curse of Mandos. This is further supported when Beren sought aid in his quest from Finrod Felagund. The Silmarils are cursed with an oath of hatred, and he that even names them in desire moves a great power from slumber. And the sons of Feanor would lay all the elf kingdoms in ruin, rather than suffer any other than themselves to win or possess a Silmaril, for the oath drives them. Indeed, Finrod had in his court two sons of Feanor, in Celegorm and Curufin, who held influence in Nargothrond and pushed Felagund to action. His own oath to ever aid the house of Barahir, Beren's father, demanded he aid the quest, so Felagund relinquished his crown and gave rulership of Nargothrond to Orodreth before journeying north with Beren. The pair ventured far under disguise, but were waylaid by Sauron near the pass of Sirion, stripped of their ruse and cast into his dungeons, where Finrod Felagund suffered death from torture. He died then in the dark, in Tol Ingaroth, whose great tower he himself had built. Beren's hope for his quest and his life waned, but he was rescued by his love Luthien and the wolfhound of Valinor, Huan, from the dungeons of Sauron. The trio endeavored many great feats, skirted death, and overcame terrible beasts in the quest for the Silmaril, which ultimately brought them through Angband's gates and into the throne room of Morgoth. Luthien sang an enchanting song, the beautiful power of which cast all present into a deep sleep, and Beren cut a Silmaril from Morgoth's crown. They couldn't escape before the hosts of evil awoke, and Karkarath, the demon werewolf, bit off the hand in which Beren held the jewel. The Silmaril filled the wolf with a consuming fire, and it rampaged in uncontrolled frenzy out of Angband and south towards Doriath, not even stayed by the girdle of Melian. Beren, Thingol, and the elves led a hunt for the wolf, which ended in sorrow. For though Karkarath was slain and the Silmaril recovered, so too did Beren and Huor die. Luthien fell into despair and passed away. But in the halls of Mandos, her spirit was filled with such beauty and sorrow that she sang to Mandos the most fair song ever woven. And as she knelt before him, her tears fell upon his feet like rain upon the stones. And Mandos was moved to pity, who never before was so moved, nor has been since. Luthien's plea of the two kindreds stirred the Valar to action. Both Beren and Luthien were brought back to life, though she no longer claimed the immortality of the elves. They lived upon the Isle of Tol Galen, surrounded by the river Adirant in Osiriand for the remainder of their mortality. From this choice they bore a son, Dior, a manifestation of the union of the two kindreds, and the lives of elves and men would mingle occasionally from this point forth. The successful recovery of a Silmaril lifted the spirits of the Noldor, especially the sons of Feanor, who saw a weakness in Morgoth since the Battle of Sudden Flame, and wished to claim the other jewels by destroying their foe. In the following years, councils and embassies were held between the kingdoms of elves and men to gather force for an assault. Those who wished to take the fight to Morgoth rallied behind the House of Feanor and joined the Union of Medros. But the ever-present curse still worked to stir unrest between elves. From the haughty claims of Medros, the actions of his brother Celegorm and Corufin, few came from Nargothrond or Doriath, but the full might of the East Marches, what remained of the northern frontier, and the western lands of Hithlum assembled in 472 First Age for the fifth battle in the Wars for Beleriand, the battle that created the most death and tragic sorrow. The fifth battle, known to the elves as the Nirnaeth Arnodiad, or the Battle of Unnumbered Tears, was a historical inflection point that marked the swift decline of Iluvatar's children for the remainder of the First Age and desolation of the elven kingdoms. At the outset, Medros and the Marcher Lords of the East arrayed themselves alongside battalions of Easterlings and a large host of Naugrim, dwarves from Nograd and Belagost. Fingon, High King of the Noldor, stood in Hithlum in the west, with the noble men of House Hador from Dor Lomin. At Medros' signal, they were to march simultaneously from both directions and smash Angband in a hammer and anvil pincer. At the appointed hour, however, Morgoth's agents fed false information to Medros and delayed his signal. Fingon and the western forces prepared to march and were bolstered by the sudden appearance of Lord Turgon and his Gondolindrim, 10,000 strong. Some of Fingon's men were goaded by a detachment of orcs and in wrath left their posts to give chase. Though they slaughtered many and arrived at the gates of Angband, it was a feint, and Morgoth issued from many hidden places untold hordes to obliterate the overextended elves. Fingon's host was disarrayed, but the discipline of Gondolin saved them, and the two elven bands were united. Finally, nigh on a week into the battle, Medros and his allies moved to join the fight. The Dark Lord emptied the full garrison of Angband to give battle. There came wolves and wolf riders, and there came Balrogs and dragons, and Glaurung, father of dragons. The strength and terror of the great worm were now great indeed, and elves and men withered before him. In fire and blood the alliance fought fell creatures of evil, and here the greatest deception bore dark fruit, for it said that neither by wolf, nor by Balrog, nor by dragon would Morgoth have achieved his end, but for the treachery of men. The Easterlings, who had been cowed or seduced by Morgoth in secret, made their true allegiance known, and in the chaos of battle turned on the elves, men, and dwarves. Medros was assailed on all sides, and though the sons of Feanor survived, the elves and men under their command perished, or were else scattered. Of the eastern flank, the dwarves lasted longest, withstood Glaurung's fire, and even sent the dragons into retreat before falling back themselves. With the east collapsed, Fingon and Turgon bore the full brunt of Morgoth. Gothmog, lord of the Balrogs and high captain of Angband, alighted on the field, divided the elven hosts, and turned on Fingon. The two clashed with steel and flame, but ultimately, Gothmog hewed him with his black axe, and a white flame sprang up from the helm of Fingon as it was cloven. Thus fell the High King of the Noldor. With their commander defeated and numbers dwindled, all survivors collapsed into the ranks of Gondolin, and as brother to Fingon, Turgon assumed the title of High King. He led a harried retreat through the pass of Sirion, protected by the rear guard of brothers Hurin and Huor, the mightiest of mortal men in the First Age. They fought to the death for the salvation of others, a valiant sacrifice that did well to clear men of the misdeeds perpetrated by Easterlings. All save Hurin perished. He was shackled and brought to suffer in Angband, where Morgoth laid a curse upon his family. The fifth battle finally ended, and without opposition, Morgoth laid siege to Brithombar and Eglarest along the coast. The Falas were destroyed, and Círdan fled with his elves to the Isle of Balar for refuge. Morgoth gained near total victory, destroying the eastern marches, conquering Hithlum, and slaying the High King. His greatest achievement, however, was in the distrust now planted in Iluvatar's children. For men took the lives of men and betrayed the Eldar, and fear and hatred were aroused among those that should have been united against him. From that day the hearts of the elves were estranged from men, save only those of the three houses of the Edain. Morgoth gave to the Easterlings Hithlum for their service, which they pillaged, raped, and ruled at their discretion. But even after Nirnaeth Arnoediad, the kingdoms of Doriath, Gondolin, and Nargothrond remained. One by one, through internal treachery and tragedy, these kingdoms would come to ruin from roughly 473 to 510 First Age, as all were bound to the doom of Mandos and curse of Feanor. Of note, the fates of these elven lands were inextricably bound to the actions of two mortal men, Tuor Eladar and Turin Turambar, whose tales are bound in the legends of the Silmarillion. Turin was the son of imprisoned Hurin and Morwen Elithwen, and prince in exile of Dor Lomin. To evade capture by marauding Easterlings, his mother sent Turin to Doriath at the age of 9 before his sister Nienor was born. Turin was slow to forget injustice or mockery, but his father's fire was also in him, and he could be sudden and fierce. Yet he was quick to pity, and the hurts or sadness of living things might move him to tears. King Thingol adopted him as his own and protected him within Doriath during his boyhood. Wanderlust and a desire to restore his ancestral lands sent Turin on many bloody tours to the north, and the curse of Morgoth brought grief upon his family. He was driven to flee Doriath, spent years as an outlaw and wanderer before coming to the protected kingdom of Nargothrond as a stranger. It was soon revealed to Orodreth, Turin's lineage, and he was given great honor, but feared the curse would now defile Nargothrond. During his stay, Turin's martial prowess and fiery action earned him the name Mormegil, the Black Sword. He grew in vanity and pressured Orodreth to give up secrecy for a more active role against Morgoth. Thus was Nargothrond revealed to the Dark Lord and his attention brought. Morgoth sent Glaurung and his horde to the cavern in 495 First Age, which began the sack of Nargothrond. The orcs had slain or driven off all that remained in arms, and were even then ransacking the great halls and chambers, plundering and destroying. But those of the women and maidens that were not burned or slain, they had herded on the terraces before the doors, as slaves to be taken into Morgoth's thraldom. Turin himself was stricken with Glaurung's enchanting gaze, and a spell cast him in stupor. When he came to, he believed his mother and sister were in danger in Dor Lomin, though in truth they had arrived safely in Doriath some time prior. Turin brought wrath upon the Easterlings of Dor Lomin, but couldn't find his family, and much woe followed him. Finally, he settled in the forest of Brethil, renaming himself Turambar, Master of Fate, for he believed the curse of Morgoth had run its course. Here, he discovered a wild and naked woman of such grace and beauty that he fell instantly in love. She was found without any memory by the men of the forest, who named her Niniel, and shortly the two were wed. But Turin couldn't rest with Glaurung flying freely in the skies. He tracked and hunted the dragon for many days, and in 499 First Age confronted Glaurung in an epic battle in which Turin was victorious, but lost consciousness with mortal wounds. His wife Niniel was close to the scene, and in Glaurung's last breath, the dragon reawakened her memories. She was none other than Nienor, Turin's own sister. The curse upon Hurin's line worked its fullest, and in shocked horror, Nienor killed herself. When Turambar came to and learned of the truth, he was filled with such sorrow and shame that he fell on the Black Sword and ended his own life. The fall of Doriath had its beginnings in Hurin, Turin's father, who had suffered in Angband for nearly 3 decades before he was released by Morgoth in 500 First Age. Hurin knew better than to see mercy in this act, and indeed Morgoth wished to reap woe from this release, which came in 2 forms. The first was revelation of Gondolin's general location. Hurin had once stayed in the hidden city in his youth, and again in old age and despair, he sought respite by King Turgon's grace. Though he was denied access, Hurin's wanderings were spied by Morgoth's agents, and the Dark Lord worked to find Gondolin's borders. Hurin next journeyed to the wasted caverns of Nargothrond, which had been abandoned since Glaurung's sack. Then he entered in, where the treasures of Valinor lay strewn upon the floors in darkness and decay. He bore with him out of all that great hoard but one thing only. Finrod Felagund possessed the Nauglamir, the necklace of the dwarves, built from jewels of Valinor by the greatest dwarven smiths of this age for the now deceased elf. It was unsurpassed in beauty save by Feanor's Silmarils. The second form of Morgoth's evil came when Húrin delivered the Nauglamir to King Thingol in Doriath. At first still bewitched by Morgoth, Húrin's eyes were finally cleared by Queen Melian, and after he gave the necklace as gift, Húrin lamented the end of his lands, his family, and so ended his life. Thingol, meanwhile, had grown obsessive through the years over the Silmaril in his possession. Thingol's thought turned unceasingly to the Jewel of Feanor and became bound to it, and he liked not to let it rest even behind the doors of his inmost treasury, and he was minded now to bear it with him always, waking and sleeping. The king requested the most skilled craftsman of dwarven Nogrod to remake the Nauglamir with the Silmaril as its centerpiece. In time, his desire was achieved, and the greatest of the works of elves and dwarves were brought together and made one. But as Thingol clasped the jewelry around his neck, avarice consumed the dwarves, who claimed the king had no right to their necklace and demanded its return. Thingol refused, and his words enraged the dwarves, who in their lust for treasure killed him. Deep in Menegroth, Elwë Singolo Elu Thingol, king of Doriath, breathed his last in 503 First Age. The Kingslayers fled but were pursued by elves. Those few who returned to Nogrod lied and claimed the elves of Doriath turned against them without cause. The dwarves assembled a large army and crossed west. At the same time, Queen Melian withdrew her girdle. Her power waned, and she had word sent to Beren in Luthien before she herself returned across the sea to Valinor. Without Melian's protection and without ruler, Doriath became vulnerable. The dwarves and elves did battle in the 1,000 caves of Menegroth. The bloodletting and sacking was a thing most grievous among the sorrowful deeds of the elder days. Beren, his son and the heir to Doriath Dior, came with a host of elves from Osiriand and waylaid the dwarves near Sarnathrad, decimating them and reclaiming the Nauglamir. Beren returned with it to the south, while Dior went to Menegroth and declared himself Dior Elukil, the new king of Doriath, and set himself to raise its glory once more. Shortly after, his parents suffered their second death, and the Nauglamir with the Silmaril came to Doriath, where Dior wore it openly and used its power to invigorate his lands. But this stirred the sons of Feanor, whose oath had been long simmering, forgotten beneath the recent woes. United, the 7 sons demanded Dior relinquish the Silmaril, but the king made no answer. They came at unawares in the middle of winter, and fought with Dior in the 1,000 caves, and so befell the second slaying of elf by elf. Dior, who carried blood of elf, man, and Maya, and was one of the fairest beings in the First Age, was slain by Feanor's son, but so too were Celegorm, Corufin, and Caranthir. The Nauglamir evaded the brothers' grasp once more as Elwing, Dior's daughter, fled with it south to the havens at the mouth of Sirion. So, in 506 First Age, Doriath, second of the 3 elven kingdoms that remained, was utterly destroyed. The fall of Gondolin was accelerated by Húrin's accidental disclosure, but is wrapped more closely to the tragedy of Tuor Eladar, son of Huor. After the deaths of his parents in the 5th battle, Tuor was fostered by surviving elves in Heathlum. He was captured by orcs while attempting to journey to a coastal refuge in the south, and spent 3 years imprisoned before escaping. He lived a lonely and hunted life, but was marked for greatness by the Vala Ulmo, the Lord of Waters, who chose Tuor as the last hope of the Noldor in exile and Beleriand. In First Age 495, Tuor journeyed through Nevrast and came to the shores of the Great Sea, whose waves instilled within him ever after longing for the water. This is where he first stood in the presence of Ulmo. The Vala guided Tuor to the secret passages of Gondolin, where he was taken up by the Gondolindrim and brought before High King Turgon. Through Tuor, Ulmo spoke, and he gave warning to Turgon that the curse of Mandos now hastened to its fulfillment, when all the works of the Noldor should perish. And he bade him depart and abandon the fair and mighty city he had built, and go down Sirion to the sea. But Turgon had grown fond of Gondolin and proud of its invisible impregnability. Believing it could withstand Morgoth, he neglected Ulmo's warning. Tuor stayed in Gondolin, fell in love with the city, as well as Idril Celebrindal, Turgon's daughter. As the pair courted, Turgon remembered a prophecy that entwined his house to that of Tuor's father, and soon a great wedding celebration was prepared for the second union of elves and men. The next year, in First Age 503, the couple gave birth to Earendil, half-elven, who will be destined for still greater things than his father. But amidst the revelry in Gondolin, there was hidden strife. Meglin, the elf and sister son of King Turgon, loved deeply Idril, and his heart turned to hatred when she wed Tuor. He would frequently mine in the mountains for ore, and lost himself in his hobby when he was beset by orcs, who then took Meglin to Angband. Under torture, the elf betrayed his kindred. He purchased his life and freedom by revealing to Morgoth the very place of Gondolin, and indeed desire for Idril and hatred for Tuor led Meglin the easier to his treachery, most infamous in all the histories of the Elder Days. Morgoth promised Meglin the realm of Gondolin as vassal after its defeat, and ordered the elf return to assist from the inside. In First Age 510, Morgoth's forces were prepared and unleashed in full upon unsuspecting Gondolin. Balrogs, orcs, wolves, and dragons assailed the city from all sides. Blood and fire filled the fair streets. In the carnage, Gothmog, lord of Balrogs, was slain, but so too was Turgon, third High King of the Noldor. The last son of the House of Fingolfin perished, as did the last of the Noldoran kingdoms. Title as King of the Noldor passed to the House of Finarfin in greatly diminished Erenion Gil-galad, who had retreated to the mouth of the Sirion some time ago. Tuor killed the treacherous Meglin and escaped with his son and wife, leading survivors out of Gondolin through secret passages. Aided by Thorondor and the Eagles of Manwë that had long protected the city, Tuor delivered his people safely to the havens of Sirion along the Bay of Balar, where they united with the remainder of fallen Doriath and mariners of the Falas. Ulmo, protector of the survivors, sped to Valinor with news of their dire need and Morgoth's ascendancy over Beleriand. Manwë, however, was unmoved. The wise have said that the hour was not yet come, and that only one, speaking in person for the cause of both elves and men, pleading for pardon on their misdeeds and pity on their woes, might move the councils of the powers. This individual was Earendil, son of man and elf. In First Age 525, an anxious peace settled on the bereaved peoples of Beleriand, and it seemed Morgoth cared little to pursue them, and more than a decade after the fall of Gondolin, Earendil married Elwing, the daughter of Dior, the fallen king of Doriath. Earendil's parents departed Middle-earth for Valinor, where it's said Tuor became the first of men to be accepted in that realm. Earendil learned of seafaring from Círdan, and the drive of the water soon called to him, pulling him into the great sea where he often sought the hidden continent of Aman. He searched many years for Valinor, desiring the Valar's aid against Morgoth, but couldn't bypass its enchantments. Then, in First Age 538, the remaining sons of Feanor gathered, and so tormented by their oath, they attacked the havens of Sirion to claim the Nauglamir and the Silmaril. Feanor's curse manifested in the third and final kinslaying. Many elves were killed, and Earendil's sons Elrond and Elros were taken captive. Of Feanor's sons, now only Maedhros and Maglor remained. But again, the Silmaril eluded them, for Elwing threw herself into the sea. Ulmo transformed her into a great white bird, and she sought Earendil's ship on the open water. The couple reunited, but despaired. Yet Earendil saw now no hope left in the lands of Middle-earth, and he turned and came not home, but sought back once more to Valinor with Elwing at his side. The power of the Silmaril guided their ship finally to Aman's eastern shores, and there Earendil spoke before the Valar. Earendil stood before their faces and delivered the errand of the two kindreds. Pardon he asked for the Noldor, and pity for their great sorrows, and mercy upon men and elves, and succor in their need, and his prayer was answered. In First Age 542, the Valar, Maiar, and Eldar of Aman began rallying a great host to give ultimate battle to Morgoth. For his valor, Earendil upon his vessel sailed through the door of night and was lifted to heaven, as was the Silmaril of Feanor that now burned bright among the firmament. Elwing, Elrond, and Elros were granted a choice to either live the immortal life of an elf or stand with the mortal lives of men. Elwing and Elrond chose to dwell with elves, while Elros chose the path of man. Finally, in First Age 545, the splendid and wrathful hosts of Valinor landed in Beleriand to save the children of Ilúvatar and deliver Morgoth's final judgment. The last great battle of the First Age, known as the War of Wrath, lasted over 4 decades, from First Age 545 to 587, saw countless dead on both sides, Beleriand ruined, and Arda itself changed. The elves and Edain joined the forces of the West, and not even Morgoth's full might could resist their march. The Balrogs were destroyed, save some few that fled, and the uncounted legions of the orcs perished like straw in a great fire. But he loosed upon his foes the last desperate assault that he had prepared, and out of the pits of Angband there issued the winged dragons that had not before been seen. Earendil descended from heaven, and alongside the great eagles slew the dragons, including Ancalagon the Black, mightiest of the dragon host. Morgoth fled to the depths of his pits and sued for peace, begged for pardon, but to no avail. He was chained, stripped of his 2 Silmarils and his crown, and Morgoth himself, the Valar thrust through the door of night beyond the walls of the world, into the timeless void. At last, Middle-earth, and indeed all of Arda, was freed from Melkor the Vala, Morgoth the Dark Lord and source of evil. The doom of Mandos and Oath of Feanor finally completed their course when Maedhros and Maglor stole the 2 Silmarils. But the one burned Maedhros, and in his effort to gain it became himself unworthy. In despair, he fell into a vast chasm, and the Silmaril was lost to the earth. Maglor, meanwhile, threw his jewel into the sea, and forever remained near the coast, walking the shores in lamentation. The greatest loss, in victory against Morgoth, came in Beleriand itself. The land was ruined, its mountains and fields sundered, and the great sea swallowed it. Only a few islands in the easternmost region of Lindon before the Blue Mountains remained. After the war, the hosts of the Valar disassembled and returned to Valinor, and the exiled elves of Middle-earth were granted pardon and allowed to enter Aman. Many dwelt on Tol Eressëa, the Lonely Isle, that they might look both east and west on the lands they cherished. But many yet loved Middle-earth and the Hitherlands so much that they remained. Among their number were Gil-galad, High King of the Noldor, Círdan the Shipwright, Celeborn and his wife Galadriel, and Elrond half-elven. So ends the First Age. The Second Age was a period of significant change across Arda that lasted roughly 3,500 years and saw a reshaping of the earth, the rise and fall of great kingdoms of man and elf, the emergence of Sauron as inheritor of Morgoth's evil, and his ultimate defeat in the War of the Last Alliance. Though enlightened kingdoms ruled in the far west, most of Middle-earth lived in benighted fear through the long, dark years. The elves would slowly wane, as would the luster of the Edain, but the beginning of the age was a time of joy and recovery in the wake of the War of Wrath. The first century saw establishment of Lindon as the realm of High King Gil-galad, whose land still clung to the memories of Beleriand, the last remnant of Osiriand above the sea. Deep in the sheltered Gulf of Lune that divided Lindon, Círdan founded the Grey Havens as an elvish entrepôt to discover and interact with other realms. The dwarves of the Blue Mountains, meanwhile, migrated from their ruined cities of Nogrod and Belagost in the now westernmost lands across the interior region of Eriador and chiseled out the great dwarven halls of Khazad-dûm beneath the misty mountains, most illustrious of dwarven lands in the Second Age. Men of Middle-earth, Easterlings, their descendants, and other communities who didn't cross into Beleriand remained in relative backwaters. Many had once revered Morgoth and lost their god. Others merely worked the land in small villages, uninspired as they had not beheld the grace of the Eldar or might of the Valar. But to the 3 great houses of the Edain who demonstrated tenacity and fought ever besides the elves against evil, the Valar built them the Isle of Andor, also called Westerness or Elena, Land of Gift. Their descendants, the Dunedain, settled this island and established the seafaring kingdom of Numenor, most powerful and brilliant realm of men to have ever existed. Much of what transpired in the Second Age revolved around the elvish and mannish kingdoms of Lindon and Numenor. The Númenóreans, though they claimed the furthest land west, as mortal men were prohibited from walking the undying lands of Aman, and the Valar forbade them from sailing west. The ban of the Valar wasn't understood by men, but intended to keep mortals from craving the immortality of the undying lands, and keep them content with their gift. Elros Tar Miniatur, half-elven son of Earendil and brother to Elrond, chose the path of men at the end of the First Age, and so led them as the first king of Numenor. Despite their mortality, the Dunedain were still extremely long-lived compared to other men, and Elros in particular carried elven blood. His reign lasted over 400 years. During this time, elves frequently came from the west across the sea to trade with Numenor, teach its lore masters, smiths, and craftsmen. Thus Numenor constructed its brilliant capital of Armenelos, its western port of Andúnie, and many other impressive structures besides. The Eldar brought as gifts Palantiri, or seeing stones, as well as a sapling of Celeborn, the white tree in Valinor. Nimloth it was named, and its vigor and faith were ever bound as measure of Numenor's own. It was a time of peace and light, but evil yet lurked in the recesses of Middle-earth. Morgoth was no more, but the Maia Sauron, his greatest lieutenant of the First Age, remained. Again, Sauron had once been a Maia, attached closely to the Vala Aule, and there was much shared between Morgoth and Aule. They both were master craftsmen and desired to create great things, but Morgoth's drive came ever from the thought of willful domination and contention with his own creator, while Aule's came from passion, love, and a desire to bring forth and share great beauty. Sauron, therefore, shared in the lore and love of crafting, but also was stained by a need to control, which are combined the chief forces in his future plans on the Rings of Power. But, after the fall of Morgoth, at the end of the First Age, we are told, in all the deeds of Melkor, the Morgoth upon Arda, in his vast works and in the deceits of his cunning, Sauron had a part, and was only less evil than his master, in that for long he served another, and not himself. But in after years he rose like a shadow of Morgoth, and a ghost of his malice, and walked behind him on the same ruinous path, down into the void. In the wake of the War of Wrath, he humbled himself and repented, but ever deceptive, Sauron fled rather than returned to Valinor for judgment. He hid for many centuries in fear of the West, but as the years passed, he felt the Valar had forsaken Middle-earth, and was emboldened. In Second Age 500, Sauron stirred in lands far to the east and south, who had already been ruled by Morgoth, and were easily bent to his will. Darkness once more cast its shadow on the land, as he claimed lordship and godhood. A century later, in Second Age 600, mariner explorers under the command of Veantor, captain of ships during the reign of the Fourth King, once again sailed to Middle-earth and established contact with men along the coast who had suffered greatly in the dark years. For most of the men of that age that sat under the shadow were now grown weak and fearful, and coming among them the Númenóreans taught them many things, and here and there upon the western shores the houseless woods drew back, and men shook off the yoke of the offspring of Morgoth, and unlearned their terror of the dark. Numenor shared its knowledge and valor with the men of Middle-earth, who in turn revered them as gods, the tall Sea Kings. A period of furious exploration and seafaring tradition followed, championed especially by the sixth king, Tar Aldarion. Cordial relations were established with the elves of Lindon and the Grey Havens. Charts were updated, the Guild of Venturers was founded, but still, Númenóreans erected no permanent dwellings on Middle-earth. Meanwhile, the elves too expanded their realms. Celebrimbor, grandson of the master smith Feanor, was himself a renowned craftsman, as many Noldor enjoyed works of ore and earth more than other races of elves. Word reached Celebrimbor that dwarves had recently discovered mithril in the mines of Khazad-dûm. a temptation he couldn't resist. And so he set out with a large group and established in Second Age 750 the realm of Eregion in Eriador, in the western shadows of the Misty Mountains. Lady Galadriel and her husband Lord Celeborn also settled in Eregion for a time. Ost in Ethel, its capital city, was connected through a great causeway to the gates of Khazad-dûm, and friendship between the two races flourished. Amidst this expansion of light in Middle-earth, Sauron resisted in secret, and in Second Age 822, High King Gil-galad warned Numenor of a growing shadow in the east, and that they must prepare for war. But Sauron kept himself and his power hidden from most of the elves, and began to fear the growing might of Numenor. Sauron sought for a bastion of his own where he might summon dark forces, so came to the land of Mordor and near Mount Doom, the volcano created by Melkor in the First Age. Here he constructed Barad-dûr, the Dark Tower. Sauron chose this volcanic land with intention, as it said that he used the fire that welled there from the heart of the earth in his sorceries and his forging. Its construction coincided with the end of the first millennium of the Second Age. For long, Sauron brooded on how best to defeat his enemies and claim dominion over all Middle-earth. He learned from Morgoth that deception and subtle corruption were great weapons when strength alone failed, so devised a plan to enslave the free peoples and bind them to his will in secret. His first target were the elves, because although men were more easily seduced, the elder children possessed greater power. Sauron was not yet so twisted that he couldn't appear fair in visage, and he approached elves under the guise of Annatar, Lord of Gifts and Envoy of the Valar, in Second Age 1200. Only in Lindon he did not come, for Gil-galad and Elrond doubted him and his fair seeming, and though they knew not who in truth he was, they would not admit him to that land. But elsewhere the elves received him, for his message was in preservation of beauty. Annatar knew the minds of elves were ever on the Blessed Realm, and though they loved Middle-earth, they worried for its weakness and their own waning strength. He seduced them with promises of enrichment and bliss of all elven kingdoms, brought on by the force of magical rings. For 300 years, Sauron entreated the elves in his disguise, teaching them much of craft, and especially of open mind was Celebrimbor of Eregion, leader of the Gwaith-i-Myrdain, the Brotherhood of Jewelsmiths, whose own love for smithing knew no bounds. At the same time, Numenor grew in bliss and power. At the behest of Gil-galad centuries earlier, and their own will for exploration, the Númenóreans began constructing permanent havens on the western shore of Middle-earth, though as yet they did not resemble the great bastions of later days. And elsewhere, Celeborn and Galadriel left the realm of Eregion further east where they came upon Lothlorien, the wooded kingdom of sylvan elves known as the Galadrim. Here they stayed for many long years. By Second Age 1500, Annatar had sufficiently warped Celebrimbor's mind, imparted his desire, though the elf thought it was his own, and together they constructed the Rings of Power. 16 rings of such craft and mysticism they would forever alter the course of history in this age and beyond. But Sauron guided their labors, and he was aware of all that they did, for his desire was to set a bond upon the elves and to bring them under his vigilance. Now the elves made many rings, but secretly Sauron made one ring to rule all others, and their power was bound up with it, to be subject wholly to it, and to last only so long as it too should last. In the forges of Barad-dûr, Sauron crafted the One Ring secretly, but he had to pull all of his energy into its fashioning to surpass the strength of the elven rings, and so his essence was tied to it. In Second Age 1590, Celebrimbor crafted 3 rings without Annatar's oversight, so they were free from Sauron's evil, but fashioned by his knowledge, so they too were bound to the One. Nenya, Narya, and Vilya they were called, and they were greatest among the Rings of Power, as they could ward off weariness, preserve the beauty of the world, and greatly enhance their bearer. 10 years later, in Second Age 1600, the One Ring was forged, bringing the total to 20 Rings of Power. As was the Dark Tower completed, and thus ennobled, Sauron declared himself openly in Middle-earth. The elves were immediately alerted to both his presence and his true nature, as Sauron slipped on the One Ring. Its pull on the three forced the elves to take them off, and they were left shocked, horrified that their actions were twisted to evil and made to fulfill their enemy's desire. In Second Age 1605, Sauron began the preparation of a great host of darkness, such as hadn't been seen since the First Age, to take by force what the elves denied him. The remainder of the century, he bided his time in Barad-dûr, gathered orcs and other fell creatures, and made new designs. He failed to conquer the elves through subtlety, so he would next appeal to the dwarves and men of Middle-earth, granting them rings of power that would slowly dominate them. But first, he had to gather them, and the 19 remained protected in Eregion. After training his legions and turning the hearts of men in surrounding areas, Sauron invaded Eriador in Second Age 1693, and began the War of the Elves and Sauron that lasted 7 years and devastated much of the West. Lord Celeborn and Lady Galadriel stemmed the first waves of foes but couldn't hold lines indefinitely. Eventually, Sauron broke through and marched to his primary target, the capital of Eregion that held the rings, and immediately invested for siege. A host of Noldor, sent by Gil-galad and led by Elrond Half-Elven, came as reinforcement, but not before Ost-in-Ethel fell in Second Age 1697. The city was sacked and Celebrimbor taken prisoner, where he suffered torture. Under duress, he revealed the location of the 16 rings, but kept secret the 3 elven rings, as well as their bearers. Celebrimbor was also forced to inscribe the One Ring with its infamous incantation, before he was shot through with orc arrows and his body defiled. Only by the intervention of dwarves from Khazad-dûm was Elrond able to gather Eregion's survivors and lead them to safety. The dwarves fought valiantly, but once they fled the field, they shut the gates to their realm, which remained unopened for the rest of the age. Elrond took the inheritors of Eregion north and founded the bastion of Imladris, also known as Rivendell, where survivors continued to stream in over the years. Sauron laid waste to the land itself and continued his march westward to Lindon and the Grey Havens, driven by desire for the 3 rings. Gil-galad's forces were harried unceasingly, and they feared collapse. But in the elves' darkest hour, a fleet arrived in the Gulf of Lune. The Númenóreans hadn't forgotten or forsaken their friends. Númenor unleashed its full might for the first time in Middle-earth, and they, alongside the remainder of the elven host, routed Sauron in Second Age 1700. The Dark Lord's forces were crushed, and he made a swift retreat to the safety of Mordor. In the aftermath of war, a white council of wise leaders gathered to deliberate on reconstruction and retribution. Imladris became the new center of elvish might in eastern Eriador. Elrond was gifted a ring of power by High King Gil-galad and a vigilant watch set against forces of evil. Though he was prevented from ultimate victory, Sauron gathered what he desired and plotted to distribute the rings across Middle-earth to spread darkness. 7 rings he gave to the dwarf lords in their mountains, but that folk were inscrutable, hard of mind and thick of heart. Sauron couldn't conquer the dwarves' wills through his rings, but the power turned them ever towards wealth and gold. Dwarven lust for jewels grew unbound, and they withdrew from much of the outside world to mine. It's said that each of the 7 dwarf hordes has as its foundation a ring of power. Sauron's final desire for the rings came down to the fate of men, weak but most easily corruptible. 9 great lords he seduced, and over centuries their minds were enthralled as their bodies withered. They would become bound to him wholly. Another outcome of the war was that the might of Númenor was revealed to Sauron, who swore vengeance against these arrogant men and bent his mind ever towards their destruction. It's said that this coincided with the first signs of the shadow appearing around the land of Westernesse, a portent of future doom. From the late 2nd millennium Second Age into the early 3rd, Númenor had already reached the apogee of its luminance, if not the height of its worldly power, and change fell upon the hearts of men. Ambition and greed colored the reigning years of Tar Kiryatan and Tar Atanamir, his son, the 12th and 13th kings of Númenor, respectively. In those days, they laid the men of Middle-earth under tribute, taking now rather than giving, Thus it came to pass in that time that the Númenóreans first made great settlements upon the western shores of the ancient lands, and they desired now wealth and dominion in Middle-earth, since the west was denied. These centuries saw the construction of great fortresses such as Umbar and Pelargir as stamps of Númenórean authority. In generations, Westernesse forgot that Andor was a gift from the Valar and that death was a blessing from Ilúvatar. Many grew to resent the elves that sailed from Valinor, envious of their immortality and the eternal bliss of the undying lands. They chafed under the ban of the Valar, became restless, and lusted for what hadn't been given to them. When messengers came from the west imploring them to maintain hope and obedience in Valar, Númenor cast them back, and so the descendants of the Edain grew estranged from the Eldar and Valinor. By Second Age 2251, two factions rent Númenor, the more numerous and violent Kingsmen who favored mortal Westernesse over the Blessed Realm, and the faithful who in secret remained friends to Eldar, kept old traditions alive, and sought to abide by the Valar's laws. Around this time, the Ulairi, the Nazgul, the Ringwraiths first walked across Middle-earth. The Nazgul were the dark remnants of those men who were given rings of power by Sauron. The centuries withered their bodies and enslaved their spirits to the One Ring's will. Their actions during the Second Age were mostly unknown, but the fact that three were supposed men of Númenor highlights the growing evil in Westernesse. Years passed, the king's men grew more brazen in their defiance of the Valar, and out of fear of persecution, the faithful acted mostly in secret. Ar-Gimilzor, the 23rd king of Númenor, took the scepter in Second Age 3102. He was the greatest enemy of the faithful. In his day the White Tree was untended and began to decline, and he forbade utterly the use of the elven tongues, and punished those that welcomed the ships of Aresea that still came secretly to the west shores of the land. The temple of Eru Ilúvatar atop the holy mountain Meneltarma was silent, and many faithful were hunted. The decline of Númenor was stalled during the reign of Tar Palantir from Second Age 3177 to 3255, who repented for the sins of Westernesse and sought to reinstate the traditions of old to spare men from a terrible fate. The White Tree he tended again with honor, and he prophesied, saying that when the tree perished, then also would the line of kings come to an end. But Tar Palantir's actions were too late to prevent Númenor's fast-approaching doom, and his brother, Gimilcad, openly rebelled against his rule with the support of the king's men. When Gimilcad died, his son, Pharazôn, returned from campaigns in Middle-earth with prestige and wealth. His power on Númenor grew as Tar Palantir shrunk. Eventually, the king died and left behind no son but his daughter Miriel, whom Pharazôn took as wife against her will and the laws of precedence, snatched the scepter by force, and declared himself Ar-Pharazôn, 25th king of Númenor in Second Age 3255. He would become the kingdom's last. Pharazôn matured in the quagmire of inward strife and outward admonition, which greatly shaped his character. Unyielding, he wished to elevate his people by the work of their own greatness, not rely on handouts of the Eldar or prayers to gods who wished to curtail them. In his time, Pharazôn became Númenor's mightiest king and most infamous tyrant. For years, Sauron's renewed might assailed Númenor's western holds on Middle-earth, as he hated and feared most the Dúnedain. He goaded Ar-Pharazôn and declared he would drive the Númenóreans into the Great Sea. Pharazôn, in his hubris, desired himself the title of King of Men and of Middle-earth, and his heart was filled only with dominion. He prepared a great war host, and in Second Age 3262 landed on Middle-earth, marching with thousands unimpeded to the fortress of Barad-dûr. Sauron saw that not even his full might could contend with the arms of Westernesse, so once more adopted a fair visage, spoke in honeyed words, and humbled himself before the king. But Ar-Pharazôn was not yet deceived, and it came into his mind that for the better keeping of Sauron and of his oath of fealty, he should be brought to Númenor, there to dwell as a hostage for himself and all his servants of Middle-earth. To this Sauron assented as one constrained, yet in his secret thought he received it gladly, for it chimed indeed with his desire. Over the next 50 years, Sauron worked through insidious ways to gain the ear and then the heart of Ar-Pharazôn. He spread lies and called it wisdom. He spoke hate and called it justice. And most importantly, he used Pharazôn's own ambition to blind the king. Thus twisted, Pharazôn soon called his sworn enemy an unparalleled ally and gave Sauron a chief position within the royal council. Amandil, his son Elendil, and his sons Anarion and Isildur were the greatest captains among the faithful and chief opposition to Sauron. Amandil shared friendship with Pharazôn in their youth and had been a close advisor before Sauron had him cast out of court. In Numenor's twilight, Amandil organized resistance and sent Isildur to gather a fruit from the white tree Nimloth to preserve the line of kings he feared now at risk. Not too soon, for afterwards, Sauron, through the king, ordered a great shrine to Morgoth constructed in Armenelos and its central fire kindled by Nimloth's timber. The smoke belched and the blood of human sacrifice flowed ceaselessly in Morgoth's worship, for Sauron turned men to believe only the darkness was worthy of worship, stoking the contempt he held towards Valinor. And most often from among the faithful they chose their victims. Numenor's glory waned in those days. Their lifespans shortened. They grew wrathful and slew one another without cause. Their temperament twisted to Sauron's own, but was obscured by the short-term boon he earned them. Numenor's military might, treasures and weapons of war multiplied. Ar-Pharazôn ruled in name, but Sauron ruled in truth. He judged that now the king's mind was weak enough to turn him fully against the Valar. And he said, "The Valar have possessed themselves of the land where there is no death, and they lie to you concerning it because of their avarice, and their fear lest the kings of men should wrest from them the deathless realm and rule the world in their stead. Yet against all justice it is done that this gift, which is his due, should be withheld from the king of kings, Ar-Pharazôn, mightiest of the sons of earth, to whom Manwë alone can be compared, if even he. But great kings do not brook denials, and take what is their due." In Second Age 3310, nearly 60 years since Sauron was taken prisoner, Ar-Pharazôn initiated the Great Armament Project, construction of an armada and arsenal the size of which had never been seen to assail the Valar and take by force the immortality so long denied men, for the glory of King and Morgoth. The faithful feared their people would be obliterated in their rebellion against the Valar, so their champion Amandil decided to sail alone and in secret to Aman, as the hero of old Eärendil had, to beg forgiveness for his kingdom's transgressions and beseech the gods for aid against Sauron. In Second Age 3316, Amandil embarked with 3 retainers, instructed his son Elendil to prepare for flight with the rest of the faithful at the appropriate time before he set sail. But Numenor had fallen too far into darkness. Men could not a second time be saved by any such embassy, and for the treason of Numenor there was no easy absolving. Amandil wasn't seen or heard from again, and Numenor's doom fast approached. 9 years after its initiation, the Great Armament was of sufficient strength to challenge the Lords of the West, and in Second Age 3319, Ar-Pharazôn sailed to Aman with glory and conquest in his heart, stoked by Sauron's manipulation. When they made landfall, no Valar, Maiar, or Eldar met them in battle. The land was dark, and the cities abandoned. Foreboding filled their hearts, and then, before the gathered host, Eru Ilúvatar himself made his might known. A passage from the Akabbaleth, the downfall of Numenor, follows. But Ilúvatar showed forth his power, and he changed the fashion of the world, and a great chasm opened in the sea between Numenor and the Deathless Lands, and the waters flowed down into it, and the noise and smoke of the cataracts went up to heaven, and the world was shaken. And all the fleets of the Númenóreans were drawn down into the abyss, and they were drowned and swallowed up forever. At a stroke, Pharazôn and the great armament were obliterated, the men who believed themselves equal to gods utterly humbled. Punishment for their hubris wasn't limited to them. Ilúvatar set forth a great changing of the world, to not only reprimand mankind's wayward path, but also to prevent them ever from desiring the undying lands again. The earth shook and shattered. The seas boiled in tumult. The continent of Aman was fractured from the rest of Arda, and now only accessible to the elves of Middle-earth, who could return home if they followed the straight path. Cataclysm then engulfed Numenor. The island was rent and then swallowed by the sea. Nearly all inhabitants drowned, save the faithful, who, spared by their devotion and the blessing of the Valar, fled with what remained of their civilization to Middle-earth. Thus the men of Westernesse were humbled and would never again reach heights Numenor had before its fall. Sauron, however, didn't anticipate the wrath that Ilúvatar unleashed, and himself was drowned. His weakened spirit returned to the fortress of Barad-dûr, where he took up the One Ring, but Sauron could no longer walk the land in a fair disguise. Malice, fear, and death became him in Mordor, but he relished the defeat of his greatest enemy. In Second Age 3320, the survivors of Numenor settled Middle-earth and founded the two kingdoms in exile. Elendil orchestrated the rise of Arnor to the north, where he built strong connection with the elves of Lindon. His sons erected the great city bastions of Gondor further south, and though Arnor claimed the seat of the High King, Gondor would be the more populous and powerful of the two. These realms formed from the mingling of middlemen, natives as well as descendants of Numenorean colonization with the Dunedain that survived the changing of the world. 7 Palantiri, or elvish seeing stones, were dispersed across the two kingdoms to maintain vigilance against Sauron's forces and communicate quickly. Anarion constructed Minas Anor to Gondor's south and west, seat of Anorion, while Isildur constructed its sister city, Minas Ithil, as Jewel of Ithilien. The brothers ruled jointly from the capital of Osgiliath. For over 100 years the realms in exile prospered, cultivated the land, progressed civilization as they could from the memory of Numenor, and remained cordial with the elves of Lindon, and even the Sylvan elves who dwelt in Greenwood the Great. The memory of Sauron and his evil faded from theirs, for they thought him drowned and his hordes dispersed. But in secret, the Dark Lord gathered new legions from within Barad-dûr and the shadow of Mount Doom. In Second Age 3429, Sauron had mustered sufficient strength and revealed himself once more by launching a blistering and unexpected strike against the kingdom of Gondor. Minas Ithil, built on the border of Mordor, fell by force, while Isildur retreated with those of his people he could to raise alarm that the faithful's most reviled enemy had indeed survived the destruction of Numenor. In response to Sauron's threat, Elendil, king of Arnor and Gondor, approached the elven lords Gil-galad and Elrond, and with a binding oath, formed the last alliance of men and elves. For 3 years they mustered forces and forged armaments, then marched across the mountains to the Vales of Anduin. Here, more hosts bolstered the alliance, including the Sylvan elves of Greenwood, the elves of Lothlorien, and even the dwarves of Khazad-dûm. Of the strife across the world, we are told that all living things were divided in that day, and some of every kind, even of beasts and birds, were found in either host, save the elves only. They alone were undivided and followed Gil-galad. Of the dwarves, few fought upon either side, but the kindred of Durin of Moria fought against Sauron. Sauron sent agents to harry his enemies and commanded field and forest burned to deny the Alliance access to resources. Still, the valiant armies in glistening arms marched and reached the plain of Dagorlad, just north of the Black Gate, Mordor's most fiercely defended access point. The dusty flatlands and nearby dead marshes would be the site of many tragic and bloody battles throughout Middle-earth's history. First and greatest among them was the Battle of Dagorlad Plains, that unfolded in Second Age 3434, when the last alliance clashed against the combined might of Mordor. Orcs, trolls, fell creatures arrayed against men, elves, and dwarves for days on end. Orofur, king of the woodland realm, and his sylvan elves had a deep mistrust of the Noldor in Sindar. They defied orders of High King Gil-galad, which cost them dearly. Orcs pushed their hosts to the dead marshes, where over half their number were slain, alongside the king. Thranduil, his son, would later assume mantle of Lord of Greenwood. Despite such clashes, the might of the last alliance won the field and surged like a flood into Mordor and across the plains of Gorgoroth. But just as the heroes of the First Age couldn't overwhelm Morgoth's fortress in Angband, Sauron's Tower of Barad-dûr withstood the last alliance, so the great armies of the three races invested themselves in a leaguer around it. The siege lasted 7 years with terrible losses on both sides. Among those gathered, Elendil's son Anarion fell. The combined might of Dúnedain, Eldar, and Naugrim pressured Sauron so much that in Second Age 3441, the Dark Lord himself led a sortie to break the siege. Blood flowed, swords broke, and the earth shook. Before Sauron, all hearts withered, save those of the two kings Gil-galad and Elendil the Faithful, who challenged him in single combat. This clash would be one of the most famous in the ages of Middle-earth. With the power of the One Ring, Sauron crushed Elendil, shattering his sword Narsil, and burned Arenion Gil-galad, last king of the Noldor. Both rulers perished, but Sauron too was defeated, and in a moment of either courage or covetousness, Isildur, Elendil's heir, cut the ring from Sauron's hand. With most of his power, his very essence tied to the One Ring, to have it taken from Sauron was like having his spirit removed. The Maiar's physical body crumbled, and his mystical energy dissipated in a shockwave. To all present, it appeared Sauron, Morgoth's inheritor and seed of all evil in the Second Age, was destroyed. Mordor and Barad-dûr fell to ruin, the Nazgûl disappeared, and the diminished orc hosts scattered to dark corners. Without his uniting presence and domination of will, many Eastern men retreated back to their lands. In the war's aftermath, Círdan and Elrond both advised Isildur to destroy the Ring of Power in the fires that had created it and rid Middle-earth of Sauron's corruption. But the man was quickly beholden to it and viewed it as consolation for his father's death. He replied, "This I will have as weregild for my father's death and my brother's. Was it not I who dealt the enemy his death blow?" He then left the field. Sauron's defeat marked the end of both the Last Alliance and the Second Age. For the forces of light, it was Pyrrhic, but nothing other than victory could describe it. Though the One Ring remained, and in it Sauron's malice and spirit were preserved in Middle-earth, and would recover over centuries, to plague the realms and heroes of the Third Age. In the words of Elrond of Rivendell, Sauron was diminished but not destroyed. His ring was lost but not unmade. The Dark Tower was broken, but its foundations were not removed, for they were made with the power of the ring, and while it remains, they will endure. Never again shall there be any such league of elves and men, for men multiply and the firstborn decrease, and the two kindreds are estranged. The Third Age was a roughly 3,000-year period between Sauron's supposed destruction in the War of the Last Alliance and the return of the king to the seat of Gondor following the War of the Ring. This age saw the inexorable waning of the Eldar and subsequent rise of men as the dominant race of Middle-earth, the rise and fall of great kingdoms, times of peace and war, and also the events, captured in detail, of Tolkien's Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings trilogy. The Third Age began with disaster. Isildur's taking of the One Ring against elven judgment forever marred relations between the two races, and never again would a united elven host fight in the wars of Middle-earth. In war's wake, Gondor claimed the lands of Mordor to keep under their vigil, lest evil return. Though men never dared to settle its desolate wastes, many fortifications and towers, such as Cirith Ungol, were garrisoned. So too was Minas Ithil restored as the capital of Ithilien. Isildur returned to Minas Anor, where he planted again a sapling of the White Tree, and delved into what lore he could surrounding the One Ring. Meanwhile, the elves of Lindon and Imladris returned to their havens. Without a king or purpose, many embarked from the Grey Havens and followed the straight path of Aman to forever dwell with their kin. Elrond and Círdan guided these endeavors, while Lord Celeborn and Lady Galadriel returned to the forests where the Sylvan Elves and the Galadrim flourished under protection of Galadriel's Ring of Power. Thranduil, the newly arisen king of the Woodland Realm, went to take up crown in Greenwood and retreated along with his Sylvan Elves into the forest's shadowed boughs. Though Sauron was defeated and his armies disassembled, there still existed orcs and evil in the wilderness of Middle-earth, and in Third Age too, the disaster of Gladden Fields unfolded. Isildur, High King of Gondor and Arnor, had spent a year in the south administering his people and defining their borders, and now wished to return to Rivendell to retrieve his wife and youngest son, but also to seek the counsel of Elrond. In haste, he and his guard began the long march north, unafraid of foes. But unknown to all, the One Ring had the mind of its creator and exerted a will of its own. It stirred orc hosts to unite in combined might and descend on the Dunedain at a narrow pass recently muddied by heavy rains. On the Gladden fields, orcs attacked and outnumbered the king's men nearly 10 to 1. Despite their heroism, the men were overwhelmed and slain. Isildur's 3 older sons all perished, as did the king, and the One Ring fell into the river, lost for centuries. In Isildur, we see the first hints of the One Ring's power and its first victim as he attempted to cross the river near Gladden. There suddenly, he knew that the ring had gone. By chance, or chance well used, it had left his hand and gone where he could never hope to find it again. At first, so overwhelming was his sense of loss that he struggled no more and would have sunk and drowned. After orc hosts stationed on the other side of the river pierced Isildur with poisoned arrows, we are told that no trace of his body was ever found by elves or men. So passed the first victim of the malice of the Masterless Ring. One squire managed to escape with the shards of Narsil, the blade that severed Sauron from his power, bringing it and news of the disaster to Elrond in Rivendell. The fate of Isildur, and especially the One Ring, would have a significant impact on events of the Third Age, as many parties sought out its power across millennia. From this point, the kingdoms in exile separated and were ruled by different dynasties. Anarian's heirs reigned over the southern kingdom of Gondor and Osgiliath, while Isildur's heirs claimed kingship over Arnor from Annúminas. For much of the first millennium, the two kingdoms bolstered much of Eriador and brought an era of peace and stability. Their growing might went unchecked as the remnants of Sauron's evils fled far to the east, the south, or crawled deep into the earth. Gondor and Arnor prospered through the use of the Palantir, scattered across their realms, which offered both protection against interlopers and union though separated by many leagues. Cities such as Minas Anor and Fornos Derain grew in population and splendor as humanity sought to move past the terrifying memory of Sauron, but elsewhere, the Dark Lord still held minds. Wild men of the East, the Easterlings, were freed from his tyranny, but such close association with Sauron stained their hearts with darkness. In the 490s Third Age, they migrated from regions beyond the inland sea of Rhûn into the hated West, where they came to blows with Gondor. Sporadic conflicts would continue for centuries, but the Easterlings broke before Gondor's might and allowed the kingdom to expand its territories and vassals to the north and east in regions of Rhovanion. While Gondor's influence spread, Arnor's shrunk. Its last king, Earendur, died in Third Age 861 and left behind 3 sons who divided Arnor into the lesser kingdoms of Arthedain, Rhudaur, and Carlodan. These petty kingdoms turned to internal squabbles, fought one another for control of the Palantir and land, and Arnor would never again attain a united greatness it once enjoyed. In the last century of the first millennium, the kings of Gondor turned their attention south to the lands of Harad, where many wild and evil men dwelt. Umbar, a port and fortress of Númenor in the Second Age, had become a haven for the king's men that survived its downfall. Their descendants, known as Black Númenorians, intermingled with the Haradrim native to the south, and took as their capital Umbar and its firth. It remained a thorn in Gondor's exposed underbelly until King Eärnil I ordered the haven of Pelargir rebuilt and refitted. It acted as a muster station for forces that led an assault on Umbar. In Third Age 933, it fell from the hands of Black Númenorians and was reintegrated into Gondor's realm. With that victory, the kingdom's borders continued to expand. At the turn of the second millennium, a most peculiar thing occurred. Strangers bearing a semblance to men, but possessed of long lives and untold knowledge, appeared and wandered across Middle-earth. They were known to the elves as Istari, or Wise Ones, and to men as Wizards. The Istari were powerful Maiar of a united order, sent by the Valar of Aman to assist the free peoples of Middle-earth. Their purpose, in truth, was to counteract the evil of Sauron, for unknown to nearly all, Sauron's body was destroyed in the War of the Last Alliance, but his spirit remained, and slowly recovered, though it would still be long before he took on a physical form. Though there were originally 5 in their order, little is known of the Blue Wizards. The remainder were Saruman the White and the leader, Radagast the Brown, and Gandalf the Grey. The Istari would prove indispensable yet corruptible in the centuries to come. In Third Age 1050, Gondor reached the apex of its martial and political power after it again subdued the Southrons in Harad. But even as light ascended, a new darkness touched Middle-earth. 1,000 years after his defeat, Sauron's essence gathered sufficient strength to once again influence the continent. His innermost desire was to reclaim the One Ring, then use its might to destroy his enemies, set all of Middle-earth ablaze, then rule over its ashes as king. All of the Dark Lord's will in the Third Age would be bent on this goal. His shadow was first felt in the expansive forest of Greenwood, where the beauty of nature grew corrupted and dark creatures multiplied, so soon took the name of Mirkwood. Around this time, the Perianath, or Hobbits, are first seen in Eriador. Hobbits were believed to be descendants of men, but shorter in stature, larger in foot, and with peculiar habits. Their preference in avoiding big folk or danger, and their contentedness as a people meant the race of hobbits was seldom mentioned, though as we'll later see, a few are integral to the events of the Third Age. The wizard Gandalf especially took a liking to hobbits. He visited often and protected their villages from harm. By Third Age 1100, the darkness growing in Mirkwood attracted the Istari's attention, who along with the leaders of the Eldar, gathered in a union of the wise to deliberate on the best course of action. Most still believed Sauron could never return and that the One Ring had been lost forever. Even the wise dismissed signs of his return, and in the southwest of Mirkwood, they discovered an evil force erected the Tower of Dol Guldur. Their reconnaissance suggested it was one of the 9 Nazgûl, now masterless, who chaotically sowed malice and strife. Known to most as the Necromancer, it would take the wise another 1,000 years before they discovered that in truth, the dark force was indeed Sauron, returned in essence. While the descendants of Númenor developed their great kingdoms, many tribes of intermingling Northmen, Middlemen, and Easterlings established their own culture on the plains of Rhovanion to the northeast. A particularly powerful band of horse lords ruled the lands between Mirkwood and the River Running as self-styled Kings of Rhovanion. In Third Age 1250, shortly after repelling another invasion of Easterlings along Gondor's marches, the King of Gondor left his son, Valakar, as an ambassador to the Northmen, and to learn of Rhovanion's customs, either for future treaty or conquest. Valakar remained as a guest for a decade, where he wed a woman of the north who gave birth to a son named Eldakar. This son of mixed Númenorian and Middlemen blood would later be of great significance in the tragedy of Gondor. In Third Age 1300, the Nazgûl, Sauron's ringwraiths who hadn't been seen in over a millennia, and for most had passed into myth, reappeared. To the wise and those familiar with ancient lore, this was a terrible portent that the Dark Lord's power in Middle-earth had been restored, and potentially commanded the Nazgûl. But still, they held hope these wraiths acted of their own accord. The Witch King, most powerful of the 9, founded the dark realm of Angmar to the northeast of Arnor as a growing threat to the 3 petty kingdoms. For a century, the Witch King gathered influence, built cities of evil and torture, and amassed an army of orcs who multiplied in the Misty Mountains, as well as men twisted to darkness. In Third Age 1409, the Witch King invaded Arnor and sparked the Angmar conflict, which lasted over 5 centuries. In his first foray, the Nazgûl's forces ravaged both Rhudaur and Cardolam, conquering their capitals and destroyed the watchtower of Amon Sol. The northern Dunedain were pushed nearly to extinction and only found safety in numbers as they rallied to Fornost and the last standing kingdom of Arthedain. The elves of Lindon and Rivendell so feared the rise of the Witch King that they sent relief forces to fight alongside Dunedain in many battles over the centuries. While Arnor was reduced by external threats, internal strife fomented amongst the noble family of Gondor. When King Valakar died in Third Age 1432, his son Eldakar ascended to the throne. But this was the first time a king possessed something other than the pure pedigree of Númenor, for Eldakar was come from the horse lords of Rhovanion through his mother. This laid the foundation for a civil war known as the Kinstrife that ravaged Gondor and lasted roughly a decade. Dunedain purists, especially those in the south of Gondor, saw Eldakar as a stain on the majesty of kings. Their outcry was taken up by Castamir, connected to the royal family by blood but without direct links to the throne, who led an armed rebellion against the king. They marched north from Pelargir and Umbar to lay siege to Osgiliath. Though Eldakar fled to Rhovanion, his son was put to death and the city was ransacked. With the king in exile, Castamir took Gondor's crown as the usurper, but his cruelty and haughtiness would be his undoing. After gaining kingship, he alienated himself from the people whose support he had relied on. He pillaged the kingdom's abundance and threatened to move the capital to Pelargir. Such brutal behavior opened the people's eyes, and they soon plotted for Eldakar's return. King in exile, bolstered by Northmen of Rhovanion, loyalists from Anorion and Ithilien, marched against Castamir, and in Third Age 1447 fought the Battle of the Crossings of Erui. Here it's said that much of the best blood of Gondor was lost as brother slaughtered brother. In the aftermath, Castamir fell, Pelargir was besieged, and the usurper's sons fled to their haven of Umbar. Though the kinstrife ended with Eldakar's victory, the rebellious corsairs of Umbar retained independence and fought intermittently with Gondor for the remainder of the Third Age, mainly in ruthless naval battles. The start of the 17th century saw the founding of the Shire, a vale of untrammeled beauty where wandering hobbits laid down roots and established a thriving community. Unknown to most of the outside world, the Shire remained a place of light and peace for much of the Third Age. Outside of this, the 17th century also saw unbearable desolation, as an infection known as the Great Plague spread through much of Middle-earth. The plague itself was created by the dark magic of Sauron and his followers in the far east of Rhûn, where it then spread to Rhovanion on the winds before making its way south into Gondor, then north again into Arnor. The Great Plague decimated both man and beast, both country and city. Over half the population of many races died from illness. The kings of Rhovanion and realm of Gondor were hit especially hard. Osgiliath and the green plain of Calenarthon were nearly abandoned. The white tree in the capital perished, and the seat of the High King was moved to Minas Anor, where a new sapling was planted in hope that it would still flourish in the realm of kings. Furthermore, the watchtowers and fortresses of Mordor were mothballed and left unmanned, which might have been Sauron's designs from the beginning. Without forces to guard against it, evil would once more gather in that place in the centuries to come. In Arnor, the last remnants of Dunedain in Cardolan fell to disease, and the region came fully under control of Angmar. Fortunately, the two kingdoms' enemies were also hit hard by plague. Neither Easterling nor Southron attacked the weakened realms in exile. This marked also the desolation of Eriador, as the population would never again fully recover in the rest of the age, and for the next 200 years, it was all the many lands could do to merely survive against such evil pestilence. After the period of trauma, war again consumed the lands beyond Gondor, as a new group of savage Easterlings known as the Wainriders invaded Rhovanion in Third Age 1851 and set the north ablaze. They pillaged and enslaved many of Rhovanion's people, but Gondor came to the kingdom's aid with a large force. Combined, the two realms marched against the Wainriders in Third Age 1856 in the Battle of the Field, which ended in disaster. Narmakil II, king of Gondor, fell in the melee, as did Marhari, the king of Rhovanion. Their armies fled in disorder. Gondor retreated its borders and forfeited all possessions east of the Anduin, save Ithilien, while Rhovanion was utterly annihilated, its lands taken by Wainriders, its people killed or enslaved by the Easterlings. Marhari's son, Marwini, escaped west with a band of refugee Northmen to Mirkwood's East Bight, where they would become the Eotheod, progenitors of the kingdom of Rohan. 43 years after their occupation of Rovanion, the Wainriders plotted to cross Anduin into Calenarthon. But the Eotheod coordinated with their enslaved kinsmen and Gondor to drive the Easterlings back. In Third Age 1944, the Wainriders renewed their aggression, which coincided with an assault of Haradrim in southern Gondor. Thus split, the kingdom's arms were hardly enough. King Ondoher, alongside his sons and sister son, sought to rush to the plain of Dagorlad and set defensive positions, but they were waylaid by an enormous force of Wainriders who beat them to the strategic location. Ondoher was utterly unprepared to meet a charge of horsemen and chariots in great weight. With his guard and his banner, he had hastily taken up a position on a low knoll, but this was of no avail. The main charge was hurled against his banner, and it was captured. His guard was almost annihilated, and he himself was slain, and Artamir at his side. Their bodies were never recovered. In what was later known as the Disaster of the Morannon, the Easterlings crushed Gondor's forces. Neither King Ondoher nor any of his heirs escaped alive. But as the Wainriders reveled in victory, Gondor's southern army, led by Eärnil, rode in haste and came upon the victors unaware. They won bloody vengeance for their fallen king in the Battle of the Camp, and the Wainriders were dispersed so completely they wouldn't take up arms against Gondor for nearly 500 years. Now wasn't a time for joy, however, as the disaster left Gondor without a king. Upon his return to Minas Anor, Eärnil was elected and crowned Eärnil II. These continued clashes with Wainriders forged strong bonds between Gondor and the men of Eotheod. But as the Wainrider wars in the south cooled, the Northern Angmar War entered a renewed period of violence. In Third Age 1974, the Witch King sent his forces from Angmar and the conquered petty kingdoms to bear on Arthedain. The power of Angmar arose again, and the Witch King came down upon the Arthedain before winter was ended. He captured Fornost and drove most of the remaining Dunedain over the Lune. Among them were the sons of the king. But King Arvedui held out upon the North Downs until the last, and then fled north with some of his guard. King Arvedui sent dire words to his brethren in Gondor for aid lest all of Arnor fall, but their ships carrying relief forces were too late. The capital of Fornost was ruined, the Palantiri were destroyed or else lost, and the kingdom beyond repair. Arvedui died as he fled towards Lindon, and with him the last kings of Arnor. When the men from Gondor landed on the northern shores, they gathered with Círdan and his host of elves, as well as survivors of Arnor's ruin, to deliver its vengeance. Their united arms crushed the Witch King's armies, and though the Nazgul escaped, Angmar was utterly destroyed. Brave men of the Eotheod settled with their families in its desolate wastes, but no more did evil creatures issue from the north. Sauron had destroyed one realm in exile, but it had a heavy price. Without a kingdom to rule, the title for Arnor's future leaders became Chieftain of the Dunedain, of whom Aranarth, son of Arvedui, was the first. Arahel, his son, was fostered in Rivendell, and so were all the sons of the chieftains after him. And there also were kept their heirlooms of their house, the ring of Barahir, the shards of Narsil, the star of Elendil, and the scepter of Anúminas. They couldn't recover their former lands fully, so chose instead to be rangers of the north, watchful against agents of darkness. The Witch King retreated to Mordor, where he gathered the other Nazgul and prepared for the coming of their master. Since the plague, Gondor left their watch over the land of Sauron and allowed his forces to gather unopposed. By Third Age 1980, the dwarves of Khazad-dûm, under kingship of Durin VI, had risen to a flourishing realm, the underground halls of which echoed with industry and merriment all hours of the day. Rich stores of the precious ore Mithril allowed Khazad-dûm to prosper, and its coffers expanded greatly. But Durin was ambitious and reckless. His greed for Mithril pushed the dwarves to mine ever deeper into the roots of the earth. Down in the lightless rock, they awoke something ancient and evil that had slumbered since the First Age, a Balrog from the Elder Days. The Balrog slew the king and his son, earning it the name Durin's Bane. The following year it ravaged Khazad-dûm, and the dwarves were hopeless to stop it. The once glistening jewel of all dwarvish people fell to ruin as the inhabitants fled. The tunnels were abandoned along with the wealth, lore, and smiths of old. Khazad-dûm was renamed Moria, the Black Pit, domain of Durin's Bane. The Balrog's influence spread beyond the mountain and into the elven realm of Lothlorien. Ambroth, king of Lothlorien, and his betrothed Nimbrodel fled south with a contingent of sylvan elves towards the Bel Falas, where they might take a boat to Valinor. Unfortunately, the king passed, and with the crown vacant, Celeborn and Galadriel came to Lothlorien and established a resplendent kingdom as lord and lady. Here, beauty flourished and light was preserved through the magic of Galadriel's Ring of Power. Thrain I, king of the dispossessed dwarves of Moria, took his people north to Erebor, the Lonely Mountain, and after years of chiseling passageways, established the kingdom under the mountain in Third Age 1999. The wealth of Erebor was crowned by the Arkenstone, an exquisite and large jewel that became a symbol of the kingdom. Trade and commerce quickly led to the founding of Dale by men just outside the mountain. Shortly after the turn of the third millennium, the Nazgul had gathered enough force to strike at Gondor. One realm in exile had already fallen. With the southern kingdom's demise, the Dunedain, Sauron's most hated enemies, would perish and pave the way for his return. In Third Age 2002, following a siege of 2 years, the Lord of the Nazgul secured the second capture of Minas Ithil, where it would remain in his possession for many centuries. Gondorians fled from Ithilien in terror, and Minas Ithil was renamed Minas Morgul, the Tower of Dark Sorcery, while Minas Anor was itself renamed Minas Tirith, the Tower of the Guard. Vile creatures stirred in the Morgul Vale, and dark experiments were conducted behind its walls, while the Ithil stone Palantir fell into Sauron's hand. In Third Age 2050, decades into war against Gondor, the Witch King issued a challenge to Earnor and goaded the king into single combat before Minas Morgul. Earnor was a man like his father in valor, but not in wisdom. He was a man of strong body and hot mood. His prowess was such that none in Gondor could stand against him in those weapon sports in which he delighted, seeming rather a champion than a captain or king, and retaining his vigor and skill to a later age than was then usual. A warrior who relished competition and sought always to prove himself in combat couldn't resist the challenge of Minas Morgul. Earnor left behind a throne with no heirs and took only a handful of his men to ride and answer against the Witch King. He was never seen again, and so ended the line of kings in Gondor. Rule then fell to Gondor's stewards, who bore the duty and responsibility of administering the realm until the rightful heir returned. For almost 1,000 years they would wait in vain. The Nazgul executed Sauron's orders well. Eriador was fractured, weakened, and bereft of noble leadership. Old alliances and old kingdoms had fallen. Darkness and tumult spread across much of Middle-earth. The rise of the Nazgul, loss of Minas Ithil and Gondor's kings, the ruin of Arnor, and the awakening of Durin's Bane in swift succession suggested to the wise that Sauron had returned somehow from his defeat at the end of the Second Age, and the shadow of Dol Guldur continued to expand. In Third Age 2063, Gandalf alone went to the fortress in Mirkwood to investigate, where he discovered that the necromancer who dwelt within was no Nazgul or dark wizard, but something else entirely. Before Gandalf could unmask the necromancer, he fled Dol Guldur. The wizard couldn't confirm that the necromancer and Sauron were one and the same. Sauron was still weak and with few armies under his dominion, so, fearing an attack by the wise, he retreated to the evil mountains of Mordor. This began the Watchful Peace, a roughly 400-year-long period of relative stability where the shadow lessened and dark creatures seldom stirred, while the wise remained vigilant against the Dark Lord. Gondor's stewards strengthened their borders and bolstered defenses. Their fief of Calenarthon gained more autonomy and mixed with local blood. The chieftains of Dunedain guided their host of rangers to fortify northern Eriador. The dwarves of Erebor and the Grey Mountains continued hewing stone and refining their crafts. Sauron wasn't idle in this time, however, and his focused attention east led to a confederation of Easterlings and other men who fell under the Dark Lord's thrall. The Nazgul in Mordor bred a new, fiercer race of orcs called Uruks, black orcs of great strength, to grow ranks. Thus empowered, Sauron returned in Third Age 2460 to the fortress of Dol Guldur and cast new darkness upon the land. In the next decades, his influence spread westward. The Uruks streamed out of Mordor and across the plains of Ithilien, where they pillaged and killed, forcing most inhabitants to flee before they then attacked the old capital of Osgiliath. Though Gondor repelled the attack, the city would remain uninhabited. Meanwhile, many Uruk and other evil creatures were sent to abandoned Moria, thus creating a blockade in the Misty Mountains and a fortress from whence Sauron could unleash legions at his whim. The Dark Lord's return coincided with the discovery of the One Ring by the Stoorish hobbit Smeagol that had for thousands of years hid in Middle-earth. It sensed the return of its master and desired to be reunited, so worked its influence on all it touched. Smeagol possessed the One Ring for many years and was twisted by its evil, though rather than unwillingly return it to Mordor, all he wished was to revel at its beauty and hide it from the world. The years would see him turn to a grotesque abomination, consumed by lust and anguish. The assault on Middle-earth unleashed by Sauron forced the wise to act, and Lady Galadriel summoned a meeting of powerful, knowledgeable individuals that formed the White Council, whose purpose was to unite and direct the forces of the West in resistance to the Shadow. The council included wizards Saruman and Gandalf, as well as the elves Galadriel, Círdan, and Elrond, and also other Eldar lords who met frequently in Imladris to share knowledge or coordinate efforts. They decided to seek out the One Ring and deny its retrieval by the encroaching Shadow. Of the White Council, Saruman was most acquainted with the ring's lore, but he would also prove that even fair creatures could be corrupted by it and Sauron's lingering will, though not for many years. Sauron's last prong of attack in the devastating years after the Watchful Peace came from the Wainriders, who now united and invigorated by the Dark Lord's machinations, waged open war upon Gondor. With few men and little time, Gondor sent word for aid from their old allies, the Eotheod, far to the north, but word wasn't swift to reach. The Easterlings crossed the river Anduin unimpeded and easily took the greatly depopulated region of Calanarthon, before Cirion, the steward of Gondor, mustered a northern army from the fortress of Isengard. His forces were heavily outnumbered. Gondor's southern army hadn't appeared, nor any allies. On the fields of Celebrant, Cirion was assailed by the Wainriders and also a detachment of Sauron's orcs. As defeat closed in, the Eotheod, unexpected and unlooked for by all, descended with their cavalry led by Eorl the Younger. In Third Age 2510, the Battle of Celebrant saw the Wainriders utterly destroyed, the orcs scattered, and Gondor victorious. The grateful steward Cirion knew the Eotheod had saved his kingdom from ruin. He and Eorl each pledged oaths of eternal friendship between their two people, and as a gift, the Eotheod was granted the region of Calanarthon to rule as kings in their own right. Eorl then stood forth, and taking his spear from his esquire, he set it upright in the ground. He spoke then in a great voice the oath of Eorl. Cirion then made answer. Standing to his full height, he laid his hand upon the tomb, and in his right hand held up the white wand of the stewards, and spoke words that filled those who heard them with awe. The oaths of Eorl and Cirion bound their people for the remainder of the Third Age. Thus the kingdom of Rohan was founded, and with it the alliance of the two realms. The Eotheod migrated from the north into Rohan's pastures and brought with them mastery over horses. There they became the horse lords of the Rohirrim. This kingdom had as its borders the river Isen to the west, the borders of Fangorn Forest and river Limlight to the north, the Anduin River to the east, and the White Mountains to the south. The great Entwash flowed through Rohan and divided into the Eastimnet and the Westimnet, which itself was divided into the Eastfold and Westfold. Kings of Rohan ruled from Edoras and held court within the Golden Hall of Meduseld. As a realm that took from what once was Gondor, Rohan found several old Númenórean fortresses and garrisoned them for their own use in times of uncertainty. Most significant of these was the Hornburg, at the base of the White Mountains. The Dunlendings, men of Dunland, which stood to the west of Rohan, resented both Rohan and Gondor, for they wished to settle parts of Calenarthon. Centuries later, in Third Age 2710, their forces surged across the Gap of Rohan, stormed Isengard, and took the old Dunedain fortress of Orthanc, last of Gondor's western outposts. Relations continued to deteriorate when Wulf, a dispossessed nobleman of Rohan, made an unsuccessful gambit for the throne and was exiled by King Helm Hammerhand. Wulf escaped to Dunland, where he gathered forces hostile to Rohan. In Third Age 2758, the long winter descended upon Eriador, Dunland, and Rohan. The weather was unbearably chilled, but the hearts of men were stirred to fire. Easterlings and Dunlendings, commanded by Wulf, coordinated attacks on both of Rohan's borders, while the kingdom's ally Gondor was itself fighting off renewed assault by Umbar and Southrons. Wulf's forces took the Golden Hall of Edoras and capital of Rohan, while the exiled King Helm Hammerhand retreated to the Hornburg, a great fortress later renamed Helm's Deep. The terrible frost, famine, and war claimed the lives of both Helm and his heir. After the next year's thaw, Hammerhand was avenged by his nephew, Frealaf, who disposed and killed Wulf, reclaimed Edoras, and pushed the Dunlendings out of Rohan. In the wake of war, Saruman claimed the keys of Orthanc, where he discovered the lost Númenórean Palantir. Saruman extended his influence across Isengard, and over the centuries he would be ensnared by Sauron, who bent the wizard's will through his own Palantir in Minas Morgul. But at this point, Saruman was yet to turn to evil. Ambition, envy, and a desire for the One Ring drove him. The next major events to unfold on Middle-earth happened in the north and followed the fortunes and follies of the dwarves. The wealth of dwarven hordes built atop their remaining rings of power attracted the attention of avaricious dragons, who had remained relatively dormant throughout the Second Age. The dwarves hid themselves in deep places, guarding their hordes. But when evil began to stir again and dragons reappeared, one by one their ancient treasures were plundered, and they became a wandering people. For 2 decades the dwarves warred with dragons, but ultimately those of Durin's folk who had migrated from Erebor to the Grey Mountains retreated once again to the safety of the Lonely Mountain. Centuries passed, but the hated memory of dragons remained as the dwarves under King Thror continued to grow their wealth. In Third Age 2770, the great dragon Smaug heard of the Arkenstone and vast store of jewels beneath Erebor, so attacked the Lonely Mountain. We are told, so the rumor of the wealth of Erebor spread abroad and reached the ears of the dragons, and at last Smaug the Golden, greatest of the dragons of his day, arose and without warning came against King Thror, and descended on the mountain in flames. It was not long before all that realm was destroyed, and the town of Dale nearby was ruined and deserted. But Smaug entered into the great hall, and there upon a bed of gold. He sacked it, destroyed Dale, and set the surrounding country ablaze in the desolation of Smaug. The dragon displaced what remained of Durin's folk, and sat atop their wealth as the self-proclaimed king under the mountain. The dispossessed dwarves of Erebor wandered in homelessness and poverty until they arrived in Dunland and attempted to settle. 2 decades after the dragon's attack, King Thror decided to return to his people's ancestral homeland of Khazad-dûm, and despite that it was in firm control of Durin's Bane and Sauron's orcs, endeavored to enter Moria alone. There he came across the orc captain Azog, who had the king beheaded and sent back as a message to the dwarves that orcs ruled Moria. This stirred such hatred in Durin's folk that they gathered arms and allies for years before launching an invasion of all orc outposts they could find in the vast caverns of the Misty Mountains. The War of Dwarves and Orcs lasted from Third Age 2793 to 2799, and fighting during this 6-year conflict became so brutal that it was said the dwarves killed with the same malicious glee as the orcs. The ultimate battle of Azanulbizar saw the death of Azog, mutilation of King Thrain II, and the legendary prowess of his son, Thorin Oakenshield. Both sides lost nearly half their force, and for centuries, the orcs of the Misty Mountains limited their incursions into Eriador. When at last the battle was won, the dwarves that were left gathered in Azanul Bazaar. They took the head of Azog and thrust into its mouth the purse of small money, and then they set it on a stake. But no feast or song was there that night, for their dead were beyond the count of grief. Barely half their number, it is said, could stand or had hope of healing. Though they were victorious, the dwarves of Erebor remained exiled from their lands for many decades, a pain exacerbated by the capture of their king, Thrain II, who was taken by agents of Shadow and brought to Sauron's fortress of Dol Guldur. The wizard Gandalf found him 5 years into his captivity on the precipice of death. Thrain gave to Gandalf his last possession, which included a map of Erebor before he passed in Third Age 2850. This would bind Gandalf to Thorin Oakenshield in the future quest to reclaim Erebor. Gandalf returned from Dol Guldur to Rivendell and gathered the White Council to inform them that the necromancer had taken residence again in Mirkwood and was beyond doubt Sauron returned. Gandalf pleaded for swift action, but he was overruled by Saruman, who in secret grew to desire Sauron's power and covet the One Ring. He believed the Dark Lord's search would reveal the ring's location and allow Saruman to claim it as his own. So for nearly another century, Sauron remained unmolested in Dol Guldur. In Third Age 2930, the line of the kingdoms of Gondor and Arnor remained unbroken through the succession of chieftains of the Dunedain, and Aragorn was born son of Arathorn II and Gilrain. Aragorn never knew his father, who died only 3 years later, and the young boy was sent to Rivendell to be fostered beneath the protection of Elrond. Royal blood flowed through Aragorn, who would be trained as a cunning ranger of the north, an effective chieftain of the Dunedain, and ultimately would step forth to claim his title as King of Gondor. But his existence posed a serious threat to Sauron, who would have him killed, so his identity remained secret for some time. Meanwhile, Saruman, who had claimed the keys of Orthanc, extended his influence around Isengard and claimed the Orthanc stone as his own. With the Palantir, Saruman spied the movements of the enemy and learned that Sauron had much greater knowledge of the ring's location than once believed. In another gathering of the White Council, Saruman this time spurred the members to action and prepared an attack on Dol Guldur, lest the Dark Lord claim his ring. Many events unfold in and around the year Third Age 2941 that are covered in great detail in Tolkien's novel The Hobbit. As these timelines are more well known and available to the general public, they'll only be mentioned in brief here. First was the quest of Erebor, in which Thorin Oakenshield sought to reclaim his lost kingdom for Durin's folk, and end their centuries-long exile by ousting and slaying the dragon Smaug. The Arkenstone, jewel of Erebor, and symbol of kingship, was critical to this quest, and its recovery required stealth. So it was that Gandalf brought into Thorin's company of dwarves the hobbit Bilbo Baggins. Curious and adventurous for his kind, Bilbo possessed all the silent craftiness of hobbits and would act as thief for Thorin against Smaug. The company of dwarves, Bilbo and Gandalf, set out on their quest, which took them through a harrowing goblin town in the Misty Mountains. It was here that Bilbo came across the creature Smeagol and the One Ring. Smeagol had been twisted by the ring over centuries and became the terrible Gollum. Baggins thought the ring a pretty bauble and magical, but was completely unaware that it was the Dark Lord's lost ring of power. He took the One Ring from Gollum and kept it hidden from all, including Gandalf. The company then came to the woodland realm of Mirkwood, where the wizard left them to join the White Council in an assault on nearby Dol Guldur. Great struggle of powers rocked the fortress, but Sauron was repelled by the combined might of the White Council and fled to his ancient domain of Mordor. Though victorious, the heroes had acted too late, and already many of Sauron's plans had matured, and his strength in Middle-earth grew ascendant. Meanwhile, Bilbo helped the dwarves escape captivity after the Sylvan Elves of King Thranduil barred passage through Mirkwood. The company arrived in the dilapidated ruins of Dale, and entered Erebor from a hidden passage in the mountain. The hobbit was meant to burgle an object of great worth, but accidentally awoke Smaug from deep slumber. Enraged, the dragon flew to the lake and intended to destroy Dale, but was shot down and slain by Bard, heir to the realm. With their great enemy defeated, Thorin and his folk returned from their long exile and reclaimed Erebor, but the celebration was short-lived. Not long after, Bard and the Lakemen came to Thorin and demanded recompense for the damage caused by Smaug. So too did Thranduil and his elves claim a share of Erebor's wealth. Thorin was loath to give up what was his by feat and right, so sent word to the dwarves of the Iron Hills, who came swiftly to his aid. It seemed greed and pride would lead to war between dwarves, elves, and men, but just as the three forces prepared themselves, massive armies of goblins and wargs took to the field, seeking vengeance for the deaths of their rulers. The Battle of the Five Armies saw the three races of fair folk align themselves against creatures of darkness. Thorin Oakenshield fell in battle, as did two of his nephews in company, but the goblins and wargs were routed, and the regions around the Misty Mountains calmed for some time after so much loss of life. Dane Ironfoot became the new king under the mountain. The lordship of Dale was restored, and Bilbo Baggins returned to the Shire with the One Ring in his pocket, oblivious to the danger it represented. A decade later, Sauron sent 3 of his Nazgul to reoccupy the fortress of Dol Guldur, while he fashioned the reconstruction of Barad-dûr within Mordor. The White Council held their last meeting, and Saruman, whose mind was bent on acquisition of the One Ring, disbanded the group, claiming the artifact was forever lost in the Great Sea, and he retreated to Orthanc, where he declared himself Lord of Isengard. Gandalf and other members of the Wise suspected Saruman of darkness. While in Isengard, he bred a new line of orcs loyal to him rather than Mordor, and gathered influence among men to contend with both Sauron and the forces of good. Saruman was, however, ensnared by Sauron through his use of the Orthanc stone, which the Dark Lord corrupted with the Ithil stone. He exerted his influence from the Palantir and dominated Saruman's will through subtle manipulation. Saruman would at times be an ally and an enemy to Sauron, completely twisted in mind and spirit by Third Age 3000. In this time, the great fires of Mount Doom awakened and shot magma high into the heavens as Sauron openly declared himself. 3 millennia after his supposed death, the Lord of the Rings returned to reclaim what had been lost and take the continent by fire. By the early 4th millennium, Gandalf suspected that Bilbo Baggins somehow acquired the One Ring. Its general location also became known to Sauron, whose agents had captured and tortured the creature golem. As both sides converged on the artifact, the War of the Ring sparked to life in Third Age 3018. As with events in The Hobbit, much of this history is covered in detail in the Lord of the Rings trilogy and will only be covered in brief here. The War of the Ring was the greatest and final conflict of the Third Age, in which Sauron and his Nazgûl commanded legions of Easterlings, Haradrim, orcs, trolls, and other foul creatures against the free peoples of Middle-earth, the kingdoms of Rohan and Gondor, the realms of elves in Lindon, Mirkwood, and Lothlorien, and the dwarves of Erebor. And caught between, Saruman, who commanded Uruk-hai of Isengard and the Dunlendings. Although Gondor and the Dúnedain were his greatest enemy, Sauron coordinated strikes across Middle-earth. In Gondor, the Dark Lord tested the strength of steward Denethor in the Battle of Osgiliath. To the north, he issued forces from Dol Guldur to strike the elves of Mirkwood, and other forces harried the dwarves of Erebor and men of Dale. Saruman, meanwhile, used magic and the espionage of Grima Wormtongue to weaken King Theoden of Rohan. In the battles at the fords of Isen, Saruman's forces defeated the Rohirrim and killed Prince Theodred. An account of the Battle of the Fords of Isen tells us that it was clearly seen in Rohan, when the true accounts of the battles at the fords were known, that Saruman had given special orders that Theodred should at all costs be slain. At the first battle, all his fiercest warriors were engaged in reckless assault upon Theodred and his guard, disregarding other events of the battle, which might otherwise have resulted in a much more damaging defeat for the Rohirrim. When Theodred was at last slain, Saruman made the mistake, fatal as it proved, of not immediately throwing in more forces and proceeding at once to a massive invasion of the Westfold. Amidst all this chaos, Bilbo Baggins had a great birthday festival in the Shire before he set out to Rivendell to rest his weary soul. He imparted his magic ring to his nephew Frodo Baggins, who along with Gandalf learned its true nature. Gandalf and the king in exile Aragorn, under the pseudonym of Strider, protected Frodo and his hobbit companions from the pursuing Nazgul through the wilds of Eriador, where they then entered the guarded realm of Rivendell. Elrond gathered a council of ambassadors from among the free people across Middle-earth to deliberate on a course of action in the War of the Ring and how best to take the One Ring to the heart of Mordor. Only there, in the fires of its creation, could the ring be destroyed. But with the continent consumed in conflict, and with Sauron's agents hunting the ring, the task before all seemed nearly impossible. During the Council of Elrond, Gandalf revealed what the wise long suspected, that Saruman was completely enthralled by the ring, and if not Sauron's servant, at least his conspirator, for he confronted and imprisoned Gandalf in Orthanc, who only narrowly escaped. In the council, Frodo Baggins stepped forward as ring-bearer. Though the One Ring weighed heavily on all who possessed it, Frodo had already brought it as far as Rivendell, and believed he could carry it to Mordor. Here, the Fellowship of the Ring was founded. The number must be few, since your hope is in speed and secrecy. Had I a host of elves in armor of the elder days, it would avail little, save to rouse the power of Mordor. The company of the ring shall be 9, as the 9 walkers shall be set against the 9 riders that are evil. With you and your faithful servant, Gandalf will go. For the rest, they shall represent the other free peoples of the world, elves, dwarves, and men. All told, the fellowship included the hobbits Frodo, Samwise Gamgee, Merry, and Pippin, the wizard Gandalf, the elf Legolas, son of King Thranduil of the Woodland Realm, the dwarf Gimli, son of Gloin of Durin's folk, and the 2 men, Aragorn, Gondor's heir, and Boromir, a valiant warrior and son of Gondor's ruling steward, Denethor. The quest of the ring took the fellowship through the misty mountains and the abandoned realm of Khazad-dûm that now crawled with orcs, trolls, and Durin's bane. Gandalf confronted the Balrog and sacrificed himself so the rest of the fellowship could escape. Bereft of their spiritual leader, the fellowship nearly foundered, but was succored in the glade of Lothlorien by Lord Celeborn and Lady Galadriel. The companions followed the great river Anduin south, until it came to the hills of Emyn Muil. Here they were beset by orc hosts sent by Saruman to retrieve the ring. Boromir fell under the ring's thrall and nearly took it from Frodo by force, but he regained his honor by protecting the hobbits to the death. After he fell, the orcs gathered Merry and Pippin and marched to Isengard, believing them to be the hobbits that had the ring. Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli pursued the orc host, while Sam and Frodo set out east alone to continue for Mordor. Thus was the fellowship broken. Aragorn, Gimli, and Legolas pursued Saruman's force across the wold and near the forest of Fangorn, an ancient woodland governed by treefolk called Ents. They confronted a strange white wizard whom they thought to be their enemy Saruman, but instead revealed himself as Gandalf, the Istar reborn as Gandalf the White, and sent from beyond death to continue his mission. Together, they rode towards Edoras and sought aid from Rohan in attacking Isengard. King Theoden, however, had been many years under the spell of Saruman, weakened in mind and powerless. The kingdom effectively ruled by Saruman's footpad, Grima Wormtongue. Gandalf broke the spell, cast Wormtongue out, and restored Theoden king to his former glory. But following the battles at the Ford of Isen and the loss of the Westfold, Rohan was on the defensive. As Uruk-hai of Saruman's White Hand marched towards Edoras, Theoden garrisoned the impregnable fortress of Helm's Deep, and commanded all to gather behind its protective parapet. Thousands of Uruk-hai, orcs, and Dunlendings besieged Helm's Deep with such force it couldn't hold. As hope evaporated, Gandalf arrived with a gathered band of riders led by Lord Erkenbrand. The Rohirrim charged into the exhausted and exposed backside of Saruman's army and led Rohan to victory. Meanwhile, Merry and Pippin, who had been taken up by Treebeard and the Ents of Fangorn, convinced them to aid the forces of good, so led a great host of Ents to bring battle to Saruman. They flooded the wizard's forges, destroyed his war machines, and kept the now broken prisoner in Orthanc. Saruman, once a member of the Wise and a powerful wizard who fell to corruption, was utterly ruined and his gifts stripped from him. Gandalf gathered the Orthanc stone and learned that through this Palantir, Saruman had communicated to the Dark Lord. With one threat removed, the heroes looked now towards Gondor, which stood alone against Sauron's greatest assault, in dire need of aid. To the east, Frodo and Sam lost themselves in the labyrinth of hills and vales, and were pursued by the creature Gollum. He desired the One Ring above all, and would resort to treachery, but Frodo commanded the creature to swear by the ring that he would lead them safely to Mordor. From that moment, a change, which lasted for some time, came over him. He spoke with less hissing and whining, and he spoke to his companions direct, not to his precious self. But he was friendly, and indeed pitifully anxious to please. Gollum seemed banished, and as Smeagol, he was a helpful guide to the hobbits. The group passed through the ghastly dead marshes and plain of Dagorlad, where spirits of old wars lingered, only to find they couldn't pass undetected through the Black Gate into Mordor. When he learned Frodo's intention to destroy the ring, Smeagol planned to lure them through the Morgul Vale and into narrow passages through the mountains that led to Cirith Ungol, where Shelob, monstrous spider and offspring of Ungoliant, made her lair. They first entered Ithilien, a fief of Gondor's that had been devastated by many wars with Sauron and remained a battlefield during the War of the Ring. Faramir, brother to Boromir and son of Denethor, captain of Ithilien's rangers and of Gondor's vanguard in defense against Sauron, found the hobbits and detained them for some time, but finally released them after learning of his brother's fate and their charge. As Frodo and Sam came closer to Mordor, its shadow spread over the ruins of Osgiliath and came to the ramparts of Minas Tirith. Tens of thousands of orcs, hundreds of war machines, the Nazgul and other evil creatures laid siege to Gondor's capital. They were aided by Easterlings and Southron forces, led by the Corsairs of Umbar. The city would have fallen if not for the valiant ride of King Theoden and the Rohirrim, bound to the Two Kingdoms alliance of old. In the Battle of Pelennor Fields outside Minas Tirith, the riders of Rohan and soldiers of the city were bolstered by a sudden appearance of ghosts and wraiths, cursed until they had fulfilled an ancient oath. This grey host was bound to Aragorn, the heir of Gondor, and swept across Pelennor in a wave of undead wrath. The battle's aftermath saw the Witch King of Angmar defeated, Theoden King slain, the steward Denethor dead, and Sauron's armies forced to retreat to their reinforcements in Mordor. Meanwhile, Gollum betrayed Frodo and Sam near Cirith Ungol, and after a near-lethal confrontation with Shelob, Frodo was taken to the fortress as prisoner by orc scouts. Sam rescued his master, and the pair, still in possession of the One Ring, crossed over the barren cracks on the plain of Gorgoroth and towards Mount Doom. The forces of the West, now under command of Aragorn, the returned king, decided a rash but necessary gambit. To distract Sauron and give Frodo time to destroy the One Ring, Aragorn rallied what men he could and marched towards the Black Gate. In the Battle of the Morannon, Sauron sent forth a force 10 times larger than the Free Peoples could muster, as well as his Nazgul, for he believed Aragorn to hold the ring, and the King of Gondor represented the Dark Lord's greatest threat. As blades crossed and melee began, the Eagles of the North descended upon the Nazgul and pulled them from the skies. And in the ultimate moment between hope and despair, Frodo entered the heart of Mount Doom. The One Ring attempted a final time to betray the Ring-Bearer, and Frodo was nearly consumed, except by the intervention of Gollum, who snatched the ring from the Hobbit. In their scuffle, Gollum and the One Ring were destroyed by Mount Doom's fire. With the One Ring no more, Sauron's essence was delivered a mortal wound. The Dark Lord was obliterated and cast beyond Middle-earth. The Shadow was banished, the Nazgul were destroyed, and the forces of evil weakened. We are told that towers fell and mountains slid, walls crumbled and melted, crashing down. Vast spires of smoke and spouting steams went billowing up, up, until they toppled like an overwhelming wave, and its wild crest curled and came down foaming upon the land. The plain heaved and cracked, and Orodrun reeled. With a cry that pierced all other sounds, tearing the cloud asunder, the Nazgul came, shooting like flaming bolts, as caught in a fiery ruin of hill and sky, they crackled, withered, and went out. What remained of their numbers were hunted down and scattered to the wind. Sauron's dark will, which had stained the hearts and twisted the minds of Easterlings and Southrons, lifted. Their union disbanded, and they retreated back to their native lands. In the aftermath of the War of the Ring, Aragorn returned to Gondor, where he was crowned Elisar, king of the reunited kingdoms of Arnor and Gondor, and his line was restored to the throne after nearly 1,000 years in exile. He took as queen his love, Arwen Undomiel, the daughter of Elrond half-elven. Much celebration went up across all of Middle-earth for the final downfall of evil, an evil that began with Morgoth in the days before time and was perpetuated through ages by his greatest follower, Sauron. The Third Age came to a close in its 3021st year, when Elrond, Gandalf, Galadriel, Frodo and Bilbo Baggins all cast off from Middle-earth to sail towards the Undying Lands. Both Frodo and Bilbo had borne a great burden in the ring that scarred their very souls, and so were granted a life of peace in Aman until death took them. Thus ended the greatest ages and adventures of Arda. Little is known of the Fourth Age and those that came after, as peace, stability, and happiness is wonderful but would make for boring tales compared to the epics of ages past. Therefore, Tolkien had written little, and here they'll be covered in brief. The Fourth Age began and completed the dominion of men and the final waning of the elves. Slowly, the Eldar retreated into the depths of their shrunken realms before taking boats from the Grey Havens over to the Blessed Realm. The dwarves of Durin's folk recovered their ancestral land of Moria and established for themselves a great kingdom. King Elisar gifted swaths of Eriador to the hobbits, who dwelt in safety and obscurity. For over a century, King Elisar and Queen Arwen ruled the reunited kingdom from Gondor, until the king's death in 4th Age 120, and the queen's a year later. The last two members of the Fellowship, Legolas and Gimli, took a boat down the Anduin, and from there crossed over the sea. In unknown time, possibly towards the end of the 4th Age, Lord Celeborn, Círdan the Shipwright, and the remaining elves left Middle-earth forever and dwelt in the Blessed Realm until the end of Arda. Eldarion, son of Elisar, ascended to the throne and reigned for a century. Of Eldarion, son of Elisar, it was foretold that he should rule a great realm, and that it should endure for 100 generations of men after him. That is, until a new age brought in again new things, and from him should come the kings of many realms in long days after. More ages came and went. In one of his letters, Tolkien suggested that a quickening fell upon them, so that future ages were briefer than the ages of legend. He reckoned that the fall of Sauron at the end of the Third Age unfolded roughly 6,000 years before 1960 AD of our own time. And it's here that we must also point out that Tolkien's Legendarium contains mytho-histories not of some faraway fairy tale land, but rather plausible if fantastical accounts of our own world's history. In this way, the legends and adventures of Middle-earth seamlessly interweave with our own forgotten past. A prophecy of old tells of the Dagor Dagorath, the battle of all battles, the last battle at the end of time where Arda will suffer apocalypse. Mentioned seldomly and only in brief, the idea of an end of days was largely abandoned by Tolkien and remains nebulous but foreboding. We are told, Manwë will not descend from the mountain until the Dagor Dagorath and the coming of the end, when Melkor returns. And also, then their part shall be to serve Aule and to aid him in the remaking of Arda after the last battle. We can therefore conclude that Melkor will return to Arda with all the forces of evil behind him, to lay waste to all lands and seas. Mortals and immortals will join in confronting him, and though Arda is doomed to be destroyed, it will be rebuilt. This time, perhaps without the evil of Melkor. In the second song of the Ainur, along with the children of Iluvatar. Out of tragedy, hope will blossom and eternal peace will come to Arda under the watchful gaze of Eru Iluvatar. So ends the timeline and histories of Middle-earth, captured in Tolkien's Legendarium. Thanks so much for watching and listening to this video. Now I'd like to hear from you. Let me know which age, what characters, and what actions most intrigue you, as well as suggestions for future videos in the comments below. And if you're a fan of lore and storytelling, be sure to subscribe to the channel where content is uploaded frequently. I want to take a moment and thank all of my amazing supporters over on Patreon, who make all of this possible. I couldn't do it without their fantastic support. If you'd like to become a lore luminary for access to me, a great community, written scripts, and early video drops, head to patreon.com/thelorebrarians to learn more. Until next time, go forth and explore the lore.